Oh baby, baby. Isn't this Britney? This feels very Britney Spears to me. I was just singing that to Christina. I have the pleasure of starting us off today. So my name is Cait, in case anyone doesn't know me, but all of you in this room primarily do. This project, my year, I've titled it Soft Body, Hard Place. And this project is about the softness of our bodies and the hardness of the built environment and the misfit between the two. In my view, there's an observable disconnect between the softness of our bodies and the hardness of the places and the spaces that make up the built environment around us. This project is existentially centered around my qualms with the hardness of this place, meaning the world, but it is driven by a central question, just as I am. How can I make the world a softer place? So what do I mean by this? Sorry, just a tech issue here. How do I? There, I solved it. So by hard place, I'm referring to the built environment, which means our surroundings, specifically anything that's designed for humans or by humans and to be used for human activity. Whether we recognize it or not, design is a conduit of ideals, priorities, and ultimately of power. And this is what I mean by hard place. The design of the world around us often seems immutable or eternal. The hard place is material, it's physical, think sidewalks and buildings and benches, and it's simultaneously theoretical. It's tied up in policies and systems and cultures and concepts, the non-physical things that make up the design of our world. And both of these things work together in tandem to maintain the hardness of the built environment. And they render, in my view, the world inaccessible to and uncomfortable for and at odds with most of our soft bodies. One example of what I'm referring to here is hostile architecture, which I brought up at length in the winter critique, but it's an intentional design strategy that uses elements of the built environment to guide or restrict our behavior. So you can think of bench dividers and fences and things of that sort. If we pay attention to where and when hostile architecture is implemented, we see who's considered public and who is not, who's granted access to a space and for whom does it become inaccessible. When I talk about soft bodies, just to be clear, I'm referring to these envelopes of flesh. I mean our physical bodies that each of us has, and I also mean the whole person. The city's designed to keep us moving at an acceptable pace of efficiency, a pace that presumes a form of able-bodied productivity. But what about those bodies that move through the world at a different or slower pace? Living in a soft body means the inevitability of changing needs and changing pace over a lifetime. Think of pregnant bodies and aging bodies and bodies that have children with strollers to maneuver, recovering bodies after injuries, or bodies in wheelchairs. The list can go on. As furniture designers, we concern ourselves primarily with the body, with form and fit and function, and we ask ourselves and our designs, who is this for? How will it work, fit, and look? At the core, we are asking and deciding, what body will this piece of furniture accept? We are asking and deciding who fits and who is a misfit. And this phrasing of misfit comes from feminist disability scholar Rosemary Garland Thompson, who explains that the condition of disability is present whenever a body finds itself in a misfit relationship with the world. Not the melodrama of a tragedy to overcome or a defect of the flesh, but a misfit, a disharmony that runs both ways, body to world and back. And she really asserts that disability is not so much a condition of the body, but a condition of the environment, of the hard place. And this is what I spent the year on, what I spent the year exploring. I was adamant at the outset, just ask Peter and Kirsten, that I didn't want to solve for the problem presented here. I didn't want to look, for example, at hostile benches and in response make a perfect bench. I wanted to stay in the gray area of questioning and deconstructing, and I wanted to be playful in my exploration and in my response, because many or all of the protest movements and designers that I am most influenced by in my life and in my developing practice do just that. They sort of straddle these complexities. They're at once serious and playful, and we can look at radical design of Italy. We can look at even the pussy hats of the Women's March from a few years ago, and we can look at the queer rights and liberation movements. So it took a lot of steps and stops and a few fumbles along the way, but this is where I ended up. Making a soft body. I made a literal soft body. You can see here, and I hope on Zoom you'll see after, or now, I'm not sure. My strong lean into textiles really started over the winter break, where I was thinking a lot about softness and being locked down. I worked with what was on hand, which was some scraps of material and my sewing machine, to start exploring in materials this idea that had been swirling in my head for a long time. And this was made purposefully to expose this misfit that I'm talking about. The misfit of a literal soft body meeting a hard place. It's didactic, and it's, I hope you think, playful a bit in nature. Like, this whole year sort of this project took on a life of its own. It became a wave, and I was sort of happy to ride along. Maybe some of you can relate to that. I designed the font that's used here to be soft looking, and I wanted it to be soft feeling as well. So I went with a puff paste, which is a screen printing ink that once heat is applied, it puffs up. And I took this soft body around the city, and I noticed in a really active and material sense all of the places that a soft body would experience a misfit. And then there is what you see before you here, a soft spike seat. Without getting too into the weeds about all of this, I was very drawn to the idea of pursuing a subversive practice as a means of refutation. I wanted to make or turn something hard into something soft. So I took on spikes as an example and a representation of something that makes our world hard and leads to misfit conditions between body and space. And then I set about turning those spikes, like you can think of spike ledges in the built environment, etc., turning them soft. I also spent much of this year obsessing over pink. It is a color with a very interesting past. Much like the features of our built environment, pink has been used to subtly guide and control humans. For example, there was a psychologist who believed a specific shade of pink calmed aggression and lowered heart rates. So prison cells were painted that shade of pink. Or we can look to the gendered use and associations of the colored pink. In general, it really captured my attention and maintained it for a long time, which is no easy feat if you know me. This is perhaps not your conventional furniture object, but it was made with a lot of thought behind it. I really wanted to make all my thinking into a physical thing. So as you can see, hopefully the spikes are plush, compressing and conforming to a body as it sits. Unlike spikes in the urban places that are typically hard, immovable, and permanent, these spikes give way to the sitter as you're lowered into the seat. They make way under your weight. The pink is a reclamation of and playful protest against the behavioral control characteristics of its past. The velvet is soft and structural. You'll see soon when you can sit on it. Underneath is 4 inches of memory foam. I chose memory foam because of how it accepts and welcomes bodies, any body. Memory foam engulfs and it accommodates, and it's another thing I got really obsessed with on this journey. The spike seat is comfy and it is soft. And I see the words and theories and inspirations that I explored along this long and winding road, alive and embodied in this thing. For much of this year, I didn't think that was something that I was capable of achieving. This piece recalls hardness while remaining soft. It takes a hard place and it makes it soft so that our bodies meet the world in a warm embrace. Your legs, your arms, your hands, your insides and your outsides, all of you that is surrounded by your skin is your body. Everyone has a body, but the reality is that whether by illness or age or accident, all of us live with disability at some point in our lives. So these questions of access, of who fits and who is a misfit, need to be seen and taken as much more than a list of design criteria. As designers, I believe it is our job to make the world a softer place. If not, we can mistakenly turn some bodies into misfits, or we can reinforce the misfit through our designs. And I don't think that will do. So with all that said, we know that I'm soft, at least those of us here in this room. Maybe definitely a little softer than most. And I just want to say that this has become a really soft place for me over the last 4 years. A place with people that have accepted and welcomed and celebrated my softness. And being here with all of you has been one of my absolute greatest joys. And please remember, all of us and those on Zoom, that we have soft bodies and we need to treat them and celebrate them as such. In so doing, I believe that we make the world a softer place. So in light of this, I have a little present for those of us here. I got the mic, it's still my show. So I made everyone here t-shirts. And please take one, there's enough for all of us in the room, just as a reminder of my love, but also of our soft bodies. We got larges and extra larges. They shrunk a bit in the wash, so if most of the gentlemen in the class, you're definitely an extra large, just to say. You got it. I'm done. I'm good. Thank you.
I'd really like to hear what you have to say, Bahar, but I don't want to put you on the spot. So if you want to start us off, or I don't know if, no, I can pass you this way. What a start. I think that was great. I love the name. It's and I feel like you kind of brought us on this journey, especially those of us who haven't been with you in this class. Yes. And I've been wanting to do that as soon as I got in. Yeah, I love it. I think it's a great idea. I love how you told the story. I think I teared up a little bit towards the end.
Sorry,
I can totally see this being a whole series, and like you having, hopefully when we can actually have shows, having some sort of a show.
Sorry, this is just a prideful moment for me.
No, take your time.
Oh my gosh. Sorry, Bahar.
No. This is great. This is feedback as unfolding. So yeah, I would definitely love to see like a whole series of this. I think it would be great. I love the thinking behind
you can lay right down, Connie.
Especially during a year that I feel like we've all gone a bit softer because we're all going through something at the same time. Yeah, I would love to see this as like a bigger thing.
Yeah.
And I love the fact that you thought about all the details, like even designing the font or the type of the puff, self-cleaning or whatever you did on it. It's I think it's great. It's also interesting. My COVID hobby has been drawing. And I've actually been doing like a similar thing where I'm drawing things that are supposed to be very hard, very soft. And I've been trying to think of a name for the series. And as soon as I saw yours, I'm like, damn it.
I had like 10 different names like that too. Yeah.
And I love the t-shirts. And
it's open for use. It's not proprietary. I would love to share.
Well, no one's ever going to see those drawings, so it doesn't really matter. Yeah. And you're very passionate about what you do, and it comes through. And I think that's really, really important.
Thank you.
When you're talking about your work, for that passion to come through. So yeah, I don't know if anybody else.
Thank you.
When you're using the mic, if you just speak directly into it, like an ice cream cone.
Okay.
Okay, Peter. Yeah, I would echo that passion. That's what came across for me. I thought that was, you nailed it, you know. And it's interesting because when I first walked in and I saw this piece here, I thought COVID, you know,
Yeah.
because it's, you know, so symbolic of the COVID thing, you know. And so I'm really surprised that it's actually quite contrary to all that. And what struck me though too when I looked at it, it was like, wow, that is so complicated to come up with, you know, and actually to tackle something of that scale, upholstery wise, is, you know, I always thought it would be beyond what goes on here at Sheridan, and you've really done an excellent job of it. But I like what you brought to it, this whole notion of our bodies. And I think there was a quote that Peter used to use for the furniture program, something about, I can't remember how you phrased it, Peter, but it picks up on this notion of, you know, our bodies interacting with furniture. But it doesn't talk about the softness like you did and how you brought that out. My question would be, where do you go from here with this? Like,
Yeah.
What's your, do you have any ambitions once you, you know, get back to a normal life and whatnot with this idea? Do you want to expand it further?
Yeah, I think a lot of what was happening subconsciously and then later throughout the year consciously for me was actually that I'm developing for myself a working methodology, I guess, that I would like to take far beyond the scope of here. So I'm not sure exactly what that looks like, but I'm very much interested in how objects make theory and questions come alive in a way that we can't ignore the same way that we can, because you're gonna, you know, I come from political science and philosophy before this, and people can choose to read or not read a paper, for example, but objects you're faced with them.
Yeah.
So that functional line, I guess, is of interest for me, and I don't know where that will lead. I've been focused on this day for a long time, but we'll see.
Well, excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks for sitting on it.
The presentation was really excellent in terms of just very concisely capturing what your idea was. I have to admit, in December, I had no idea what you were doing.
Me either.
But you really kind of, aww.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, it really has a alien sort of life of its own.
Did you get people's reactions to it?
Yeah, in public, we it was my wife and I who I roped into helping me carry this about town. But people really reacted to it with interest and intrigue, and yeah, a lot of weird looks, actually. Mostly, you know, people in Toronto, they're like a bit standoffish. Better not engage.
I was actually going to say, I really, the images of this around the city, I found that really captivating, and it's nice to have that as a complete package. Yeah, it really fleshes out your idea to have that body with the images as well, not just these two pieces together. So I think to exhibit this work, that would be a really important part to include, is to have those images as a kind of a at three minimal parts of this package to show, because that really helps to drive that point home even more so.
Okay. That was the hope, so I'm glad to hear.
Yeah. I'm just some really sort of detailed questions. Just curious about your choices, how you made the person, you know, the crossed arms and the feet sort of outwards. What were some of why were those decisions made in terms of just the proportions of the body and the fact, you know, that the ankles are turned out?
Yeah, I think I wanted it to look, human in some capacity. I started working on the body and sewing. I started by sewing a lot of hands and arms. And I wanted it to look body-like, but without making like a full mannequin-esque, where you can get into doll making where the joints meet and it becomes more human.
Right.
In sort of the same manner, but I wanted to keep it simple and playful. And when I started this, I was much worse at sewing than I am after having achieved this. So there's a lot of that involved too. It's just, this guy's better than the first version of him. His fingers and things are more refined, while still, I wanted to keep some of the weirdness and some of the play, to not make it too literal, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean,
he's exaggerated purposefully.
Yeah. I mean, I think those decisions make it look like a floppy soft body, you know, so in that regard, I think, you know, those were good decisions. The spikes on the couch, I find them, I read them in kind of two different ways. I certainly get, you know, I think of the cut glass on top of the concrete wall, but also just because there's variation in the heights, it's got a little bit more of an organic feel to it. So it could be, I can also see a forest of trees. I can see kind of microscopic amoeba or something that lives on Mars. Like there's a few, there's a nice quality in that of not just referring to harshness, but also subtly referring to a few other things in the world.
I wanted it to be able to live apart from any meaning that I give it, and still have it mean something or cause some sort of pause for whomever sees it wherever it is. So I really like that you can see all of these different things in it. And I appreciate your comment of it looking COVID-esque as well. And I think all of that is okay and welcome. And I'm happy to see this obscure object take on a life of its own.
Yeah, I think
in a way.
I think you know, it's a very bold piece, but there's some subtlety involved. So that's a great success when you can make something that isn't just interpreted in one way. It's got enough complexity to it that we can see different things in it. And that's really, I think, got everything to do with design decisions about how big those are, how many there are, what part, how they're attached, and all those kinds of things. So I really think you stated clearly what you wanted to do. I know that built over time, but all of your design decisions here really reinforce that. I mean, it's quite clear, I think, without being too much hitting you over the head.
Thank you.
And that's a hard thing to do.
Yeah.
So congratulations.
Thank you, Con.
I don't know if your classmates, I would imagine, might have some stuff to say. I just quickly, I think it's really interesting that Bahar's comment about the series, because I think that's one thing that we sort of talked about after the holidays, the week 5 sort of check-in crit. And I do think, I know it's been a really challenging journey with lots of ups and downs, and I think you did a really fantastic job of tying all those threads together, you know, and weaving a really strong narrative with your research, you know, tying all those threads together was really well done.
Thank you. That means a lot.
Anybody in the room have any comments?
I'll say a couple of things, and that there's also another mic over there. Anyone can speak into that. I'd agree with Kirsten. I'm not going to reiterate, but I want to really commend you on the clarity of the presentation and what you said and what you wrote, and how clearly that described the project. And I know that this is a culmination of a bunch of cul-de-sacs, I guess. And it, as Kirsten mentioned at the start, this is, this project and everyone's project is really, what we're seeing today is the tip of a veritable iceberg. And I'm very delighted to have seen it wrapped up in such a conceptually satisfying way. And it was interesting that Rob mentioned that it had this that the main object here had a kind of COVID quality, because we're so in it that I didn't pick that up. Mm-hmm. And that's the weird thing, about being in this world and, knowing your research and your intention and where that was coming from. That was what I was reading. And that's why it's so delightful to have someone come in who hasn't been living and breathing and sweating over this. And I'm not talking about you.
No. I told you yesterday you're equally as responsible for this as I am in some ways.
Well, I have documentary evidence of Christina assisting you with that upholstery. Yeah. So
many guilty parties.
So congrats. And I was surprised to see the soft body figure pop up in your documentation a few weeks ago. And it seemed to be representative of something that I didn't fully understand until today. So thanks for that.
Thanks,
Anybody else?
Definitely kept us on our toes, Peter? Because you really tied the threads together. The
last moment.
They were in your head. I think they were there, but just even with the coming together of the process document, which you just kept us holding on by our fingernails right until the last minute. So I was glad to go back in and see your final print version and how you did really, again, pull that narrative together.
Just to say thank you to you both for sticking with me. I know it was a fingertip grip the whole time.
But let's hear from your classmates.
Check. I just wanted to say that I found that incredibly inspiring, how you wove the theoretical elements of this presentation together with how everything came together practically. And I mean, we've talked about this project at length together throughout the year, but I just still feel so surprised by all of the new information that you just presented us with, and it's going to be processing over the next few days. So yeah, congratulations, Cait.
Gwen, that means a lot. Please do come sit on it.
It's less of a question and more of a comment. But I think too, because I think we've all found ourselves in the situation where you're on this huge road and you have so many things at the beginning, so many thoughts to try to pull into it. And then to do the heavy lifting to then turn that into these very articulate and consistent details. I only noticed for the first time today, and I think it's a new thing, the lifting off the ground and the very consistent embroidery around each, stitching. I don't know, I'm not a textiles guy, but around each cone, to sum it all up physically is the job, and you did it, and kudos. And I remember picking up this fabric with you, and it was what is this going to be? And it's so cool to see.
Thanks, David.
Are you looking for a back, Bahar?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's a very interesting experience too. I know it doesn't quite allow for it here, but with two people.
Bahar is just commenting on how at first she thought that she could weave her body through the spikes, not realizing, I guess, how soft they were.
So that's interesting.
Kids would love this.
Yeah.
Rob just said kids would love it.
it would be interesting watching people interact with it. Like, you know, if this were to become a body of work that you continue to explore, like really playing with the scale of the spikes. So, you know, they are obviously the glucose drum
Yes.
seating comes to mind.
The green one.
The
Or-
self-skin foamed
Oh, yes.
green seat, you know, but something like that where you can really play with your body in interaction with it. It is just the tip of the iceberg of all these
Certainly.
explorations.
The possibilities with cones, now that I've figured out how to sew these, yeah.
Yes, lots of interesting opportunities for a future photo series too, with the different bodies interacting. Just trying to repeat some of the comments that aren't making it into my.
I was just noticing how the spikes being like a imitation of the harshest elements from what you're building against, instead of them like they're doing like completely the opposite. When anybody sits on it, they actually move in towards them and give them a hug. So I thought that was really great.
Yeah.
All right, if we are good, I'm going to continue on. So we got
Yes.
a little over a half hour there, which is
Thank
fine.
you very
I feel
much.
like the first person always gets a little extra time because it takes us a bit to get into our groove.
The technical difficulties.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Cait.
Thank you.
And Lee, if she would pay for shipping, she wants a t-shirt.
So I don't have t-shirts, I'm sorry. But I do have emotions. I'm a little more welled up than I thought I'd be. Okay, hello to friends, peers, old faculty, and not, well, you know what I mean. Former faculty and fellow soft bodies, and people joining us on Zoom. And thank you. Bahar's not here, but should I wait for Bahar to come? Okay. How's everyone doing? Yeah. Hello, Toronto. I'm gonna walk over. I'm gonna do some crowd work. Just getting my water bottle. I don't need to tell you that, but I have a mic. Although this is going to be difficult. But
David,
yes.
actually play with the Zoom settings on the screen, just so for us in the room, could you move those up or maybe get rid of the one? Do you know what I mean?
Toggle. You're asking me to toggle?
I think you can just drag them off of your, like you can drag that to the side. And it should anchor to the side, I think. No, maybe not.
It's like the
I thought
DVD
it
bouncing
did.
thing.
Oh,
It's
I
just
thought it
never
did.
going to go away.
I thought that one would, okay. Well, the other one should go to the side.
Sure.
Definitely anchor at the side, just to have a little bit, oh, it's not anchoring. I don't know why. Okay, sorry.
Okay. So my name's David Lewis. For this presentation, I'll generally just take you on the sort of journey that was this year, because that's really the best way to explain what happened. So this project is titled Sheet Music, a Mosaic of Moments. And it's rooted, there we go. It's rooted in my upbringing as a musician, but also like a tinkerer. So I was obsessed with toy kits like Connects and not necessarily Lego, but modular building kits. I was always kind of building things, but also very driven to learn the cello at a young age because it was sort of a family instrument. So for this project, I interpreted that, and I have in the past for past projects, as this kind of pacing between music, which is a temporal art, and design, which is a spatial art concerned with material objects. So trying to figure out a middle ground between those two to situate my work. And since I studied architecture before this, I was always kind of fascinated with this saying that architecture is frozen music, which is a bit of a cliche, but it's inspiring to me in the sense that if architecture is frozen music, then that means that the environment is something that either performs or is able to be performed, which would mean that humans are the sort of inherent performers of the built environment, which is a really compelling and engaging concept to me. So for this project, thinking of architecture as frozen music in between those two disciplines, I asked, how do the roles of the composer and designer compare? How can material objects respond to a dynamic world? And how can furniture act as unfrozen or liquid architecture? So I looked at works that sort of do the same thing in that they try to position themselves between music, performance, architecture, building. And I really heavily relied on this metaphor of performance as building or building as performance, the making of something, sort of enacting these moments to bring a material thing together as a performance in and of itself. So these are certain projects that I looked at. The yellow background image is Peter Cook and his Block City, which is a series of drawings that basically extruded a musical score, a traditional linear musical score, to create sort of an urban center and an architectural theory based off of music scoring. To the right, with the orange sculpture, is a piece by Earl Brown. It's a musical composition that was performed in tandem with sculpture by Alexander Calder. And the sculpture, as oscillating, actually corresponds to something called a graphic score. So the performers are interpreting the score sort of through the frame and lens of the object in the room, and the audience sort of gets a different iteration of the performance every time they see it, based on the oscillation of this object. So rooting an object in the performance is really something that engaged my mind. And then at the bottom is a sort of a very influential figure for me. His name's Lawrence Halprin. He created the Lovejoy Plaza in Portland. And he talks a lot, or he used to when he was alive, talked a lot about, it's a landscape architect, about how to score the built environment, how to imagine the world and design the world as sequences rather than spaces. And ultimately spaces result from that. But imagining, you know, at what time of day should the water flow at this pace, or, and, you know, how many people are going to be here, scoring out the moments that the people that were interacting with his work were going to be engaging with, so that he could better understand how to make the space itself. So that's, and then he creates these dynamic spaces that allow for sort of interpretive public performance like you see here. And a lot of this is rooted in graphic scores. So I think graphic scores kind of situate themselves nicely again between music and architecture. They're very spatial objects, they're very abstract. They came around a time in the 1960s, 1950s, when electronic music, the advent of electronic music, meant that people were starting to really draw music rather than notate simply. And it opened up all these sort of artistic avenues for not just musicians, but graphic designers such as Cornelius Cardew, so the bottom left, who is a musician as well, I should say that, but he approaches music as a graphic designer. It opened up these avenues for them to really experiment with how we transmit knowledge of sequences to performers. So how we, as composers or designers, input sort of the information that we want people to get out of our work into our work, and then see if they get it and see what happens from there. So graphic scores often result in performances that are different every time. And for the purposes of this project, I interpreted that as sort of a modular approach to furniture craft. And luckily, throughout this process, I came across an artist named Diane Simpson, who's an American sculptor. And I found this work very compelling, as it came at a point where I really started to think about, okay, so a score is a flat object. It's a two-dimensional object, but it requests a three-dimensional act, which is a performance. So Diane Simpson really poignantly, I thought, does this sort of scoring work in a different sense, where she's scoring cardstock or all sorts of paper materials and creating these sort of isometric views, but in three-dimensional form. And also in this work, a samurai on the left, She's representing something three-dimensionally and two-dimensionally simultaneously. So that was something that was really important to me, because when you see a score, you can imagine the performance of it. It sort of renders not just itself, but this kind of idea of a sequence in your head. And then it reminded me of some of my favorite projects I've done here, which are the cardboard structures, very quick kind of one-off structures. But Audrey and I did this one, I think, in second year. And it's just engaging to see what you can achieve with a flat piece of material. And I've always been interested in just sort of, I guess, on a more hyper-functional level, furniture that unfolds. And especially right now, you're seeing this huge insurgence of work from home typologies, which I don't necessarily think this project goes along with, but for me, it was an anchor point, sort of an industrial anchor point, that allowed me to kind of pull in certain functionalities into the work. And I've watched these designers pretty much for the whole time I've been at Sheridan and have just been interested in their work. So on the left is Michael Hilgers from Germany, and on the left or right is Lozy Designs, and they work mainly with Baltic birch plywood to create all sorts of bespoke kind of modular items for the home, and they just launched a work from home collection. So thinking about trying to program form and function into a flat. And then through this project as well, I was reminded of my childhood when I was so lucky to have a mime class, like a physical theater class at my art school once a week for 5 years, which is just a treat, you know. And every Friday we'd put up these huge scenery flats. They were just big black folding panels, and that would allow us to do all these sort of improvisational activities and kind of just set our imaginations free. So all these things are kind of combining in my mind to think of how I can work with a flat object to bring out some sort of performance. Sorry, my voice is a little dry. So a really engaging exercise for me was collage. And this helped me to really, so this is a work I produced. This helped me to kind of center the aesthetic and spirit of the project. So it incorporates works from Cornelius Cardew, who's just a prominent graphic designer and musician and graphic scorer, and as well as images from people interacting with the work of Lawrence Halpern. And then the background image was actually taken around the same time these works were produced in the 1970s by my mom in Greece. I just thought it was a beautiful image and brings sort of a depth to the environment. And this process of collage is ultimately the turning point in the project for me, because it got me to a point where I was scoring sheet material. To me, that felt like a very productive metaphor and very engaging as well. So I thought, okay, let's set these parameters of a blank sheet of black cardstock and let's see how many folds I can come up with and basically see how many forms are possible here and what kind of, how the material itself can perform. So from there, I started a design objective. So my goal for the capstone design process was to create a collection of movable and graphic furniture objects organized around functional moments to be performed by a user. This performance was imagined as a physical manipulation of the object over time. And the collection was to be presented as a kit of parts with various arrangements, hoping that this adaptable kit of parts would spark creativity in the user or observer and provide display and division functions in interior space. So at the outset of my design development process, these were the criteria. So it must be adaptable and movable. It must take a modular systems-based approach to furniture design, because that's what we're here to do. We're here to make furniture objects. So pulling all this thought on music and graphic scoring into the physical realm. It should be aesthetically driven by graphic scores. It should use materials that are readily available and suitable for rapid prototyping. And it could, and this is really just a could, include accompanying instructions composed in the form of graphic scores, probably arriving sometime around 2023, and be featured in a sonic or theatrical performance, like a scenery flat would. So just to kind of rapidly go through this, because I know we're short on time. So I started exploring all sorts of folding and hinging planes, first with cardboard on the CNC, which was a really fun exercise and really easy to build up to full scale. And those are the tool paths below, unframed, but you can see the frames within the objects themselves. So just kind of seeing what was possible. And what I liked about this process was, you know, kind of like if you're a composer, you're working with different musicians and parts, and each kind of has to move out of the way of another at one point. So working with positive and negative space within the material and insisting that I don't introduce any more elements than the material offers already. I was just trying to figure out what could unfold with what was there. And then around the midterm in second term, the idea was to, around the final critique in the first term, the idea was get this object off the wall. All of these objects were just hanging on the wall, except for this one that I clamped up, which was just a fluke, but they're reversible. So I wanted to try to take advantage of that. So I zoomed in and tried to think of the details and trying to think of how to scale it up and stand it up so that you can walk around it and really engage with this perforated object. So these are renders of what I thought would be an engaging sort of composition, and really just scaling up the panels to be almost a visual or physical catalog of everything I had worked on up to this point, and getting it to a point where I thought, okay, this is something that I can develop a system for and plug it into and really refine. So this is the opposite of refinement, but this was basically every test I did grafted on to what was actually an offcut to sort of build up this, it wasn't very functional, but this object that we were just able to feel and touch and interact with and ultimately perform. And then I got lost in a rabbit hole here and just went through this rather arduous but engaging process of composing and composing and recomposing and recomposing. I started on the left, you'll see that was probably way back in January, of imagining that maybe a seat was possible, but then I moved to thinking that this was more practically a shelving system with pulsable mirrors and reflecting surfaces. And then as you can see, as it moves to the right, we get to what you're seeing here today, the last two. And that was just a very long process of zooming in on every single detail to make sure that this was actually a very cohesive system. And it was all done pretty much on the CNC, which I never thought I would do, but I'm happy I did, because it really rapidly kind of forced me to pump out prototypes and reiterate and reiterate and reiterate, and ultimately led to the final prototype. So I'll give some time so that we can talk about it. So sheet music is a human scale structural system of scored sheet materials and stabs, which are the supports. This system is composed of a mosaic of moments with folding elements intended to invoke a tactile performance of the surrounding environment. And when unfolded, the structure serves to frame and augment views within a space through unique perforations, while also providing various display surfaces. Taking influence from architecture and music, sheet music represents my devotion to exploration and craft and iterative processes. So I was fairly pleased with the outcome, and I think from here, I now have a system that I can sort of imagine different iterations for. And I think because I come from an architecture background, I can't help but try to just build up these huge spaces in my mind. So this is a sample of that sort of environment summed up in an object. So thank you.
Who would like to start commenting?
Yeah, is everything open? Okay. So it's intended to, you can have any combination of open and closed at any time, is that?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Engaged with.
Yep, go for it. Just be a little careful with your.
Exploratory wise, so without maybe you showing me, I would like to try some stuff.
When's the release date for your sheet music EP? I'm just,
Probably 2023 again.
Dave, I love how much of your personality is in this piece. And I
really?
just, when you were going over your presentation, made that like witty connection between, I don't know how it took you this long, translating scores on a sheet of paper into scores on sheet material. So nice.
Thanks. Did you hear that? There, good. Say that.
One more time for the back of the room.
in the mic. I was just saying, I thought it was an incredible piece. When I looked at it earlier, you had me guessing, like, okay, it's repeating the same pound, more or less, right? And it looks like I should be able to slide. I didn't want to touch it. Like Connie said, I didn't want to break anything, but it makes you want to touch it, makes you want to engage with it as part of the performance, like you were saying. I really enjoyed the way you so more or less succinctly described your process, going from music, your interaction with all that, and everything that you've been doing. And, like, I didn't know you had studied architecture, for example. I knew you were into music, but I didn't know how much and everything like that, right? I mean, I don't have a huge amount of information about your background. Now I do.
I could tell you more.
It'd be interesting to do something like what Cait did and set this somewhere with a remote camera and just see how people perform with it. The one thing that's left out is audio.
Yeah.
Like when you say music, I'm thinking, okay, I saw the cello and I understand the staffing and, measures and a little bit of music, but there's nothing audio going on with it. So it kind of, that part of it, I thought, I understand the interaction and the movement and all that as part of the performance. But I wonder somehow if when you slide this or that or move this, that there's a note or there's something audio, what's the word I'm looking for? That,
like a triggered sound.
Yeah,
or,
something, yeah. I mean, you can hear the wood sliding.
Yeah.
But that's very mechanical compared to a musical notation or a musical thought.
So there are two quick thoughts there. It's funny because I didn't really include it here, but for an ancillary study, I did a bit of work with Arduino boards because I thought, if this object is going to move, we better try to pick up on that movement. It's just something that I think I put aside as a tabled goal for the future,
right?
Because I was more focused, and the music as well, just because I was focused on creating and fabricating just the basic system. And the other thought was that I did a lot of reading of a musician named a composer named Christopher Small, who talks about music not as a thing but as an activity, so not necessarily centered around sound. So that was kind of my justification for putting, like, music to him was more about this act of gathering and buying your tickets and going to the theater. It's a social act. So that comforted me to not, because obviously I wanted to make a composition, right? Yeah. Or get someone else to do that. But that was why I tabled that. And then I think in the future, it would be fun to collaborate with a composer and get them to just take this and not say anything about it. Just go with it. Yeah. Thank you for your feedback.
One of the images too, there was like a code, like there was like it looked like musical notation. But I was thinking in terms of, you know, the CNC code, if that had some kind of musical,
So
written musical connotation as well. You know,
the cover image is actually the bolts and hinge groove
Yeah, that
tool paths.
yeah, that. Now, if you go forward about 4 frames, next one, right there.
So the top is yeah, these are all graphic scores. So you could take this and
Yeah, so
run
I
with it.
wondered if the CNC, you know, input somehow could relate to a score
Totally.
like this.
That's what tool pathing, that's what it felt like. Because I was
yeah,
I was programming this machine to do all these things and you never quite knew if it was going to do it.
yeah,
Yeah.
and it's very physical too.
Hmm.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob.
It's, yep, like you, more of a comment, less of a question. I feel a bit like, you know, first time caller, long time listener, I guess, to continue on this metaphor or illustration, but to see you stick with this and through this in a way that's entirely not how my brain operates, but very much how you do and are, not just in your thinking, but to see, you know, connects and the playfulness, like even remembering McDonald's as a child when you would like, they would have those things or playgrounds and you slide them around.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of that, which is you and connects and all of those things, and how you were tediously stuck with and followed through on the thought process. And now to hear that described, looking back, I look forward to where else you're able to take this and whatever that looks like. It's, yeah, like chef's kiss.
Thanks.
This object.
Thanks, Kate.
Anyway.
I think it's a really interesting concept. I loved how you walked us through kind of your initial thoughts and inspiration and your journey to get to this final thing. And I also found a lot of inspiration in your kind of earlier exploration. I think just those cardboard scoring exercises that you did on the wall, like I could see that as an art piece on a wall. I think those were really interesting. Another thing that was nice about it was how minimal they were. I think it's extremely satisfying kind of figuring out how to move things in and out, and the slides and like the little support that also comes out with the slide. Must have been really fun and challenging to figure all this out.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot of potential here still aesthetically to kind of push this a bit more. I love all the stuff that's happening and just kind of seeing your thinking of how to make all these work. But I wonder how you can push it aesthetically. You know, how the screens are supported, thinking as, and I'm sure you've had probably like considered the composition here many times. But I think this could be like a really beautiful piece. It could be pushed to be almost like a functional thing, but it could also push to and art, more of a, you know, art statement,
like an installation.
Direction. In terms of aesthetic, I think just thinking about the composition, you could even introduce color into it, which would have a lot of potential. Thinking about the how you're supporting it structurally and maybe how to simplify that so that you can let the composition and all the slides and shelves speak. But I think overall it's a really great kind of exploration and pretty challenging. Like this is a really challenging piece to figure out, and these work incredibly well. Like they all operate very smoothly, which is very impressive. So
Lucky.
congratulations.
Thank you.
And Dave.
Hey, Audrey.
I remember you telling me, obviously together a lot, that you've been thinking about this sort of modular system since you had finished architecture, and it was something that you felt like you just needed to explore. And I was wondering how you feel now. I think you obviously explained, but do you feel satisfied? Do you feel not satisfied? Do you feel excited by the possibilities? Just how do you feel at the end?
That's a good question. I feel a little tired. I feel confident in my prototyping skills, my rapid prototyping skills, because yeah, like I appreciate Bahar you saying that these were working correctly. A lot of the time it was a bit of a gamble, and it, not to be too on the nose about it, but it did feel a bit like music composition where you're scoring, but you're not completely in touch with the performer or the performance, and you don't know quite how it's going to work out. And because of the timeline as well, the last two shelves here weren't tested. They were thrown in there, but having them work pretty seamlessly made me feel like, even if this isn't the final thing, which it is at this moment, it gives me kind of something to stand on as I kind of move forward and work on my kind of systems design skills.
Just on that note, I remember maybe at the midterm you were talking about different materials, and you were thinking a lot about like colored acrylics and transparency.
Yeah.
Maybe you could recall. I don't really remember everything you said about that. That was interesting.
I think that's what brought in the mirrors. That was the first thought. And as well, I know we're short on time. The color is something, it's one of these things where at a certain point, I was just focused on designing the system itself. And that really consumed a lot of my time. But I would love for the locks, at least the internal locks, like in here, to be colored, and to sort of experiment with shading the caps with the bolts. And even, I have the vector files, so I could create vinyl prints and all sorts of overlays to go over these things. And if they're hanging on a wall, you could have a template behind it with some graphic coming through, or a light board coming through. Does that answer your question? Yeah. That's kind of what's going on in my head, yeah.
If I could just say a couple of things. I'm going to miss the rigor that you apply to your work. It's been really inspiring to see that, and the consistent grinding away, but with a very direct purpose, has been really exciting to see. And I certainly don't know anyone that's explored that cusp between two-dimensional and three-dimensional in such an effective way. And there's something, as Bahar mentioned, how satisfying it is to operate these objects, and the sound of the clicking and clacking, does drive that kind of childhood memory in such an interesting way. And I think your presentation and this project has so thoroughly melded your various influences and the way you've sort of deeply investigated the connections of all those things. It's really, it's a very rare thing to see. And I know that this is the kernel of many other possibilities. And so, yeah, I just think it can get bigger and better, and has such a relationship to landscape and to architecture and to collage and all of these aspects. It's almost impossible to categorize what you've come up with, and that is really interesting to me. So yeah,
Thanks, Peter.
Terrifying in many respects.
Thank you.
Hey,
Hey, Connie.
I am like blown away by both your process and the final object. Just, the rigor and the multiple approaches to exploring this idea. And I'm particularly interested in the collage that you were using, and I'd love to talk to you more about that after. Just in terms of what I'm seeing here right in front of me, I have some really immediate reactions to it. As a static object, it feels very mathematical to me.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, math is patterns. So I'm seeing these patterns, but it's sort of a chaotic rhythm that, I'm faced with here. And these staccato points kind of superimposed over almost what looks like an electrical circuit diagram in some ways.
You're picking up what I'm putting out.
Okay. All right, good.
Yeah, good word, staccato.
And then when it's being moved, we see it, I see it turn more into the composition that you're talking about. They're a little bit, and it's inviting you to come and do that. But it kind of has two, in my mind, it has two very distinct existences from each other, the static and the in motion, in composition, which is, it's just a thing. It's not a good thing or a bad thing.
I think it's a happy accident.
Yeah, I mean, it's a completely engaging object as a static object, and it's a completely engaging object as a moving object. The idea of the composition comes through a lot more clearly when it's being manipulated.
Yeah.
But I'm still seeing a rhythm to it statically. I guess yeah.
I appreciate
Fantastic.
that. Thank you.
I'll just be brief because we're really long on time. I think picking up on the music theme, which is not just picking up on it, it's all about that, but just the moments within. And I cannot stop looking at where two moving parts intersect, and you have like there's the hinge that's horizontal and vertical, where there's the mirror piece that swings out and the shelf that swings up, for example, like just the planning and weaving together of those parts, like little moments, that are really lovely to settle on. And one thing I would love to talk to you about more too at the end is just with the conversations we've had over the term about the open-endedness of these graphic scores and the interpretation. I'm just curious how you feel about this. Like the object is incredible, and the level of detail and consideration. It's like it's an engineered piece, So I don't want this to seem too negative, but I'm curious what you think.
Yeah.
Is Connie used the word static, and there is a limitation about how these things can be manipulated. It's there's sort of almost two ways, and that's it. It's not open-ended. It's actually very prescribed and controlled.
Yeah. So I mean, sorry.
Yeah. So I'm just curious how you feel about that compared to the open-endedness of.
I don't mind it at this point because I've read critiques of indeterminate music and graphic scores that say it's no different than making a linear piece of music and expecting the performer to adhere to it. Like, you're still asking a performer to do something. There's still a bit of a dictatorship going on, right? So it's like, as makers and composers and designers, we can't help, at least I can't, but zoom in on every single aspect of the piece. So it does forfeit a bit of that concept, but it's kind of, it also exists with a bit of attention with it. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think because the panels the test panels that I had, yeah, they were only folding two ways. My solution to that within the timeline we had was, okay, well, 2 ways times 8 or 9, or like, I don't even know how many shelves are on it, and then how many different combinations do we have now? That's, so it's a bit exponential. So within the time frame, the solution was to kind of take this more exponential approach than with the binary, I guess. Yeah.
Great.
But
All right,
thank you for your guidance and your patience.
Thank you, David. I'm going to close that.
Hey everyone, my name is Kunwarbir Aneja. It's nice to meet you. Rob, you may remember me as the guy with the endless stream of questions. This is Cait Kalb. It's been a pretty long journey that started about a year and a half ago, and I'd love to get into it with you. So the way it started was, I don't remember exactly which class I had, but the assignment was to write an essay about some kind of a design era. And frankly, I was really disinterested with all my options. So I started to just figure out my own. As I kind of discover my own roots as a Sikh, I wanted to understand if there was a consistent visual design language between the objects that we see associated with the Sikh identity. And so I decided to look at weapons, architecture, and instruments as my source of information. So all three of these things are incredibly important pieces of history, and they're significant to the identity, and they're significant to the philosophy, and they're obviously very visually enriched. So I figured out essentially that, in a span of about a week to try to write this essay, what those kind of relationships could be between all three of them. And I figured out that there was some kind of iconography happening, which I had to figure out. And there was a deeper meaning behind all of these objects. Like, a weapon wasn't just a weapon. There was a reason that it existed. And the architecture there was a reason that it was designed the way that it was designed. So I started looking into these things, and these two essentially became the forefronts of what I call Sikh design. So visually, there is some type of relationship, historically. And more importantly, there's almost always a meaning or some kind of connection to the philosophy. So for example, here on the left-hand side, we have an image of kind of a bay window of the Harmandir Sahib, and Harmandir Sahib is the most significant pilgrimage Gurdwara for the Sikhs. In the middle is a stringed instrument called a taus. Taus is Persian for peacock, and quite literally it looks like a peacock with actual peacock feathers in the back. And so there was this insane connection to nature in almost everything that you found, whether it was the ornamentation on these flat surfaces, or whether it was the form itself taking the shape of this animal. There was always some sort of connection to nature, which I found really, really fascinating. So these two, after a lot of research and a couple months of critical thinking, or at least I'd like to think so, led to these two design directions, Pratak and Falsafa. Pratak is what I would call design driven by tangible historical objects that we can look at and we're like, this looks like this and this looks like that, and in those two ways, they are connected. Falsafa, on the other hand, has nothing to do with the way that it looks. It has nothing to do with the way of the traditional sense of the word design. It has everything to do with why it was made in the first place and what was that person thinking when they made it. And so if we think back to the most important tenets of Sikhi that at least that relate to me, they are oneness, the idea of divinity, and love. So oneness and divinity are connected because the idea is that divinity exists absolutely everywhere. It is within you, it is around you, it is the only thing that exists. You have to kind of do that work and figure it out and try to connect with it. So the idea of that there's divinity over there and I'm over here, that's where that disconnect comes from. If you have me over here and divinity over there, now there's two. It's not oneness. The idea is that I am divine and I have to try to recognize that and do that work. So in terms of the visual and tangible historic objects, I looked at Maharaja Ranjit Singh's throne and the architecture. Those are the two things that were really, really, the weapons played an important part as well, that kind of played into this. And so one really important thing to note, what I found was that looking at these historical objects, like the architecture, like the throne, they themselves connect back to the philosophy. So in the end, you usually come back to the philosophy, whether you like it or not. And so in that way, I found these two so intertwined. So an example of Pratak, which are the tangible historical objects we see. The overmantle you see here, it's like 4 feet wide. It's quite massive. It's designed to look just like a gurdwara. And you can see that it has heavy, heavy ornamentation. And you can see the different elements you would have of a gurdwara, like the domes on the top. Top right is a Toronto artist named Nep Sidhu. He's a multidisciplinary artist. He does a lot of metalworking, and here he has, I don't even know what to call it because it's so sculptural and it has a little bit of a functional element to it. But you can see how this is directly influenced by a plan view of the Harmandir Sahib. So in this way, it's just tangible, it's visual, and those are what the relationships are. If you look at falsafa now, you can kind of see that if I looked at this, I would not even know that had anything to do with Sikhi. I mean, like, I would recognize the symbol that's drawn there, but other than that, it's just a painting. The same goes for the one on the right, which is even more abstract. What is the connection to Sikhi? The one on the left, what is the connection to Sikhi? So it's the philosophy that is now driving these elements. The one on the left is actually another Toronto artist named Cait Kalb, who is essentially reading a piece of scripture, which is talking about the vastness of the universe, how there's different worlds out there with different creatures and different identities that we couldn't even possibly imagine. And so she is painting what comes to mind. And in that way, that work is Sikh design, just as much as this work is Sikh design. Similar to the ones on the right. The one on the right, a bunch of artists all around the world were asked the question, what does divinity look like to you? And this is what they came up with. Another one of the questions that I wanted to answer for myself was, being a Sikh who likes to make stuff, is the work that I make inherently Sikh design? That's one thing I wanted to think about and answer. So coincidentally, this is a shelf that I made 2 years ago now. At the time, I wasn't really thinking about Sikh design. I just wanted to make a cool looking shelf. But in retrospect, I realized that I was thinking a lot about, it's called the wave shelf, by the way. Lehar is Punjabi word for wave. And it's inspired by the flow of water. And more importantly, it was driven by this concept of hukam. And hukam is in Sikhi, it's like the natural order of things, going with the flow, essentially. So retrospectively, I realized I was thinking about Sikhi this whole time, even though looking at this, it's just a cool shelf that anybody could have made, really. But it is Sikh design because it has that connection with the philosophy, and that's the intention behind the piece. So those two design directions, thinking about all these things led me to my objective for this project, which was, how can I reference Sikh iconography within my contemporary style? And how can I reference and translate Sikh philosophy to this physical object that I would make? This is the culmination of those, my attempt at answering those questions for myself. So to go a little bit more deeper on the throne, this is Maharaja Ranjit Singh's throne. It was designed by a Muslim, Hafiz Muhammad Multani, in the 1820s. It is made of wood, and then it's gold plated, and that gold is worked like crazy with an insane amount of ornamentation. And obviously it connotes a heavy amount of royalty. This form specifically, if you look close and you know a little bit about this, is derived from the lotus. So the lotus flower within Sikhs and a lot of other Indo cultures as well is a very significant icon. And it is essentially a symbol for purity and divinity because it grows and it lives in really murky, muddy waters, but it's always clean. And so my translation, the interpretation of all the Sikhs around the world is that it's not just a pretty thing to look at, it's kind of something that you want to strive to be. If we compare this world like muddy, murky waters, and we ourselves are the lotuses, it's our duty and kind of our goal to try to remain as clean as possible and recognize the purity and divinity that exists within us. So this is how that form connects back to the throne. It's called a double lotus base. It's used for a lot of really important figures all around the world. And it would be like the bases of statues. And in this case, it was on the base of this throne. So I took that, and my initial question was like, okay, how can I, if I was working with this guy, Hafiz Muhammad Multani, and we were working on this together, he's got the style of the past and I've got the style of now, how would I bring that throne into the contemporary times? That's kind of what I was thinking about when I was drawing these kind of sketches. And you can see I've highlighted the ones that were really compelling to me. The ones that struck me were like the really interesting balance between contemporary yet strong connection to philosophy and history. So I moved into model making, and these are some of the models that I made on the top right. And the second one is the one that I felt achieved that balance, and I moved forward, and I made more, and I made more. And it's led to this. So this, as you can see, it's a little bit incomplete. There are just a few tiny details, a little bit of sanding here and there, and it'll be pretty much done. a little bit more work, but you get the idea. So this is the ehsas. Ehsas, by the way, ehsas in Punjabi means sensation, feeling, and realization. And so I chose that word very specifically after a lot of deliberation, because the idea for this throne is that it's a space for meditation, mindfulness, and rest, because that is one of the ways as Sikhs how we recognize the divinity and purity within ourselves. Meditation is very key. And so when you do that, it's how you kind of recognize that, like, I am just a body walking around, but who am I really on the inside? Like, can I recognize that divinity within myself? And you can see on the arm here, there is a pattern that I've drawn. This pattern was made up of, again, it was taken off an axe from the 1800s that a Gujarati had made. And as you can see, it's got a lot of floral motifs in it. And so I took the different elements that existed and I tweaked them and I worked them. And I made this pattern which then just flows across, and you can't really tell where the starting is. You can't really tell where the beginning is. There's a couple of Easter eggs in there too. This little thing right here is actually the number 1, which is, again, a very significant number. Scripture, Sikh scripture starts with the number 1 instead of a word to signify, just that importance of oneness. And this right here, the middle dot and the top right, those two represent the throne itself. It's a single petal around the bud of the lotus that you're sitting on. Another thing I wanted to touch up on regarding oneness is that I found super compelling that the philosophy of Sikhi is all about oneness, but the history of the arts and crafts revolving Sikhi are also about oneness. So I've mentioned that the throne was made by a Muslim. The pattern from here was made by a Gujarati. Architecture, Sikh architecture, was inspired and taken heavily from Haveli design. Haveli means mansion, and mansions were popularized and worked on and developed by, again, Muslims. And then a lot of elements from Haveli designs, including the dome, came from original Hindu temples. So it's like, in a world where you have so many different cultures striving, instead of the Sikhs of that time being like, we're going to create our own identity, they essentially cherry-picked the stuff they liked and they kind of made it their own. And I think that it's absolutely, like, the way that they've done it and the way that it's been developed so far is such a beautiful and really, really interesting phenomenon that I was really, really excited to investigate. And so this idea of oneness existed not only within the philosophy and like the talk, but they walk the walk as well. And the history of the design and the history of the crafts show that. And so here you can kind of see everything that I envision this throne to be and where those connections are from. So I'd mentioned that my kind of goals for this throne was that the backrest is a single lotus petal enveloping the bud of the lotus that you're sitting on. And so this is one lotus of many, and you're just one little piece of this puzzle that makes up all of it. Without you, it wouldn't exist. Yet you as a singular petal is so important to that work. So everything was driven by the throne and then in connection to the lotus flower, but it was also driven by the architecture separately. So you can see how on this image of the lotus flower here, how there's petals that sit right on top of the water. Those petals directly influence the way that the ornamentation is going to exist on the base there. And that shape of that is taken exactly from the domes, which again connect back to the lotus. It's all kind of connected in this really interesting and weird way. And so another really interesting thing that I kind of realized halfway was that the way that this thing is made is of a bunch of different staves. If you can imagine the way an old-time barrel is made with a bunch of different parts that connect onto their sides. The concept is called coopering. So this whole thing is just coopered, and it's driven me absolutely crazy. But the coopering, this entire form is made up of 26 individual staves that come together. And that number is also kind of significant because within the scripture itself, instead of alongside just the Sikh gurus and their writings and their philosophy of Hindu poets, Muslim poets, and Buddhist poets have also been included. And the number, all of those count up to 26 people who didn't identify as a Sikh, but their philosophy was in line. So their work was also included and held in the same high respect and regard as the rest of it. So that is Takht-e Ehsas. Yeah.
Would someone like to kick us off with some comments? Connie? Bahar, do you want to start?
You're a great presenter. I'm kind of
Thank you.
jealous of that. No, I think you did a really good job presenting and projecting your voice and like being, telling your story. And that's really, really important when you're talking about your work. It's a great asset. It's also okay to show up to your crit with something that's not finished. That's what I did. Remember? I showed up with bits and pieces of a chair, as long as the final one is the way you wanted it to be. I think that's totally fine. I really like all the things that you were thinking about and considering, and where you decided to go for inspiration instead of, what you might see on design blogs and what were kind of like the popular design that we're surrounded by. I think it's brave to kind of go for something that speaks truth to you and you relate to. I also love the idea of when you were talking about, basically it's a throne. And if you think about, thrones are designed to send a specific message and feel the person who, make the person who sits in them feel a certain way.
Yeah.
And I think that's really interesting of thinking about furniture, and the same way you would, for example, walk into a church or any kind of religious building and that kind of feeling that you get, even if you're not religious. How would a piece of furniture do that for you? So I think that's a really interesting thing to think about when you're thinking about a piece like a throne, With that said, I feel like there's a lot of room to push here with like the scale, the proportions, to create that feeling.
Yeah.
I love all the details that you thought about, and kind of all the meanings that you thought about, of taking different inspiration from different places and bringing it all in one piece. That's interesting. But how can you push this to like really exaggerate now that you're going for, like, it's not a typical chair, it's basically a throne.
Yeah.
How can you really push that idea and like own it and like really make a statement with it?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because before this scale existed, there was a throne that was almost like a third the size larger. Like this entire thing could have fit inside that first one. After making it, I definitely felt like a king. There was a lot of space. I could almost curl up and lie down in there. But one of the things that is really important to message is exactly what Kirsten's doing right now, is that the different paintings and the images that I had of that throne, they all portrayed the kings and the various people sitting in it as either sitting cross-legged or as a conventional chair. So that became a driving force, is that you should be able to sit cross-legged, especially because as Sikhs, that's usually how we meditate anyways, is sitting cross-legged. And then from those images and from the throne itself is how I got my idea of proportion. The throne originally, historically, was designed to be kind of lightweight, which this does not do. This thing is heavy as hell, but it was designed to be lightweight so it can be carried around on the backs of elephants and like go to war and go to different meetings and such. So that's where that proportion was really driven from. But I would absolutely love to take this kind of style that has been developed and just like push it to the extremes, like see how large it can really, really get. This idea of connotations of royalty that you mentioned were also really important. And I struggled with the idea of calling this thing a chair or calling this thing a throne, because this thing is not a regular chair and it would be a disservice to call it that. And the idea of throne, I was kind of hesitant because especially in Occidental, within the Occidental Western world, the idea of royalty and the idea of thrones, they have a very almost harsh connotation behind them of like these really like rigid rulers with their reign on power and all that type of stuff. But this idea of royalty really stems from if you and a king or queen were sitting side by side, like if you walked into a gurdwara, you would be given the same meal at the same time, you'd be sitting at the same floor and eating it together. The level of respect that someone who is deemed royal would be getting is the same level of respect that you would be getting. So that idea of equality was insanely important, especially 550 years ago within India, where if you wore a turban and you weren't a king, you would probably get your head cut off. These type of ideas were, and like the Sikhs were oppressed people. They're because their ideas of equality and their ideas of freedom, their ideas of oneness were not accepted because they went against that grain. And so to come up as like, they came up as the underdogs and eventually like took over India in the span of a couple hundred years and became these royal people who were held, who still like, they acted as regular people. They held those values of equality and oneness and love for all. And so sitting in this throne is really about reclaiming this sense of personal royalty that everybody should have. And that personal level of self-respect and self-resilience and like that, the way that you see and carry yourself that you should have. Like you, when you walk into a room, you're not better than anybody else in that room, but you're also nowhere below them. And remembering that of yourself is insanely important. Thank you for your comments, Barbara.
I think that's a great point, and that's a really nice way of looking at it. It's like the chair is empowering you almost. It's like the chair is a power pose almost, like when you're in a power pose and you feel good about yourself. Like
Yeah,
that's
it's a really good reminder of who you are,
Yeah.
who you should be. Thank you.
I do think it's interesting that Bahar mentions the scale, because I've had some issue with you calling it a throne. I know we started with throne, but because we had early conversations about, that no one is supposed to be better than somebody else. So a throne by just its definition sort of implies that. So I've always been drawn to the idea of it as a meditation chair or something to really repose in. And given that, like, it's not a great sitting chair for myself or like Connie or Bahar, if you had it even larger, and then maybe there were even some throw cushions and stuff in there to make up, to accommodate more people. And I think you could also mine the culture for more patterns and textiles. Like there would be other crafts that you could explore, like in terms of you could do textile, like, we're not going to do it right now, but like these are other potentials for exploration. That's what I'll say.
Thank you.
I think it's really great the way that you brought it all together for yourself. And I've learned something more about Sikh. And just your intention of defining what the design possibilities are and wrapping it up with the oneness and the divinity, right? That's quite challenging. And when I think of myself and trying to come up with things like that, I don't know that I don't have that kind of history or background, obviously, that you have. I have other ways of approaching that. And it's interesting that, when I think of my own work, when I look at this piece, I've made some pretty large chairs that felt very throne-like. And I remember people commenting on that, right? And I always wondered, like, where the hell did that come from in my understanding of all this, right? And I like the way that you've defined it for yourself. I like the drawing that you had of it, and the that explanation of the design that wraps around the arm, and then the base, the lotus design that goes into the base. I think that's going to help a lot. And is it just going to be left natural wood, or will it be lacquered color or something like that? Like I couldn't quite tell from there.
Yeah, I'm gonna leave it just as it is for a couple of reasons. So the original throne was obviously gold plated, and while the $400 that we're given doesn't really cover that much gold, the way that the wood that they had used was shisham, which is a rosewood, and rosewood here is like $35 a board foot. Like, it's insanely expensive. And I was like, yeah, I think I'll make it out of shisham, like honor the real thing. And after thinking about it a little bit more, I realized they used shisham because that's what they had. That was their lumber that was prevalent all throughout like that land.
It's like maple here.
Just like hard maple here. It is like what they weren't trying to be grand and royal. Like the gold did enough of that. They chose the wood that was the most accessible to them, and they went with it. Personally, I just love the way hard like maple looks, and I've used it for almost every project that I've done here. And I think that it has like just the right amount of color to contrast and help almost every other color that you can pair it with. You can throw blue on there and it'll look great. You can throw red on there, it'll look great. As far as like coloring goes, I wanted it to keep it light and also not look like gold, but just keep it light in the way that it would kind of not take away and be this kind of like dark, really dark, so what I'm looking for, like it's a really dark and kind of almost intimidating figure. By keeping it light and having these bright pops of colors, I kind of wanted to keep it that calm presence that I'd like to believe it has.
So the decoration that goes on the edge.
Yeah.
What is that? How is that applied? I missed that.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. So I spent a couple weeks developing that pattern, and then I spent a couple more weeks getting it milled with a metal CNC to create this kind of stamp.
Oh, so it's a stamp.
It's a stamp.
Oh,
and
yeah.
you'll see that's how it'll be applied all throughout.
Oh, cool.
And
you don't apply any pigment or anything like that to.
It'll be finished with Osmo Raw.
Right. I was just looking at the way it's imprinted, embossed.
Yeah.
If that was filled with a resin.
Yes.
And then sanded,
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm just
totally
wondering, So you just hammer that in, and then the base, it would be that lotus flower. It's kind of upside down, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's upside down again to kind of to emulate the way that the lotus flowers are. Like the petals are up in this way, and then as those petals come down, they are in the way what we would describe it upside down.
Mm-hmm.
The way that they just sit on the water. In terms of coloring it, I wanted it to remain kind of contemporary and clean. Like ornamentation is not my thing. I've never been a fan of it.
Yeah.
But I also wanted to stay true to the history.
Right. So you're also going for this more contemporary look,
yeah,
you said.
Exactly.
And I think you've achieved that with this. I think that you've been restrained, I guess you could say, considering where you started from.
Yeah.
And that restraint, I think you've come up with a beautiful form that has potential for other things. And as Kirsten said too, that's what I was wondering about too. If it was a bit larger, it becomes like what we call a love seat, or somebody can sit closer with you or just engage other people with it as well.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's to come or whatever. Like, where do you actually take this? Are you going to pursue more what you would in this form of design, what you've defined for yourself?
Yeah, I think that it's a really fantastic launch point for the things that I can take further, because in everything that I've made here, they've always been in a response to the assignments that we've had. Like, we made a coffee table because that's what we were asked to do. We made a box because that's what we had to do. And yeah, of course we can make that box and make that coffee table look exactly like we want, but I never had that amount of passion for what I kind of discovered in doing this. Like, to think back to the fact that, like, those instruments, by the way, they were made by hand by the gurus, right? Like, to think that the guru was also a maker, you know, is absolutely beautiful to me. And so to think that, like, I'm really staying true to my roots and making something that it's not really cheesy, like they'd be proud of, is really cool. I wanted to just, the last point, we were talking about the contemporary style of this. So I wanted to remain contemporary, and I didn't want that ornamentation to distract, which is what my original considerations and thinking are about ornamentation, that, like, it's unnecessary and it kind of distracts from the overall form. And so keeping it imprinted and not filled, and keeping it really light, you have a sense of discovery within the object. Like, when you go and you sit down, you place your hands on it, you can feel it, and you see more and more the closer that you get. So it kind of really invites and draws you in. And then to answer your second point, yes, I think that if I investigate more and more into what Sikh design could be and has been, that I'll really be able to just expand this vernacular across the different types of furniture that we have.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see other Sikhs' response to this and how they view it. I mean, you've had a lot of time to think about it and develop it, but how will the rest of the community engage with it?
Yeah, so I have been the sole designer of this, but I, in my research, have reached out to multiple peoples who in their own right are like the experts of weaponry and experts of Sikh history, experts of the architecture, and kind of gotten their thoughts and insights about this piece. What I wanted this piece to be was familiar yet contemporary, in a way that a Sikh from Punjab is looking at this and he's like, oh, I totally get what you're trying to do here, right? But you also have someone who is not of that culture be like, that's a really contemporary looking chair that, you know, maybe get rid of the tip and I'll have it. I remember that was one of the comments from, like, the last critique we did, like, why is the tip there? That, you know, it's kind of, I would like to believe it's a really nice balance between contemporary and history. And of all the friends that I've shown renders and models to, they are really excited, and they kind of, I don't even have to tell them what I'm trying to do. They kind of get it, which is a really satisfying feeling for me. Yeah. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Oh, done.
Peter, I just don't know, did we hear?
Yeah, just briefly, I know it's always a challenge to rein you into actually getting away from the design and obsession of working on the computer and bringing you into the studio to actually work on things. And so I think there are some great learning experiences that you've had working through this. I obviously would love to have seen it complete, because there are elements that you've had to describe that would enhance the experience that we can only, you know, extrapolate. So yeah. But that being said, it was nice seeing someone occupy this object from the side when Bahar sat down in it, and the relationship of the shape of the arm and backrest to the position of her sitting in it, it completed the object. So that's, I think that's great. And the scale issue is always going to be a challenge. It started out being something that was too large for a single person and too small for two people. And so you went in one direction rather than the other for logical reasons. But yeah, I mean, I'm looking forward to seeing it finished, obviously.
Me too. Yeah. Thanks, Peter.
I just wanted to add that it's been great having your perspective in the program. You know, we have a pretty Eurocentric approach to a lot of our work. So it's fantastic to have this point of view. If I can just reflect back to you what I've seen, you made a comment that you're not into ornamentation, but you're actually all about ornamentation. That's the only thing you've done here. So, I don't think you're into ornamentation in terms of, highly dynamic forms.
Yeah.
I think, of maybe the few pieces that I've been more connected with, it's been a fairly simple form with surface pattern. And I'm intrigued that you don't, that in your initial slides, you didn't refer to language as one of your inspirations, because I think the written language really actually has a strong connection to a lot of the detailing and the patterns that you're working with. And I would just encourage you to think about that in the future as you carry on this conversation with yourself about what Sikh culture is. So, well, what Sikh culture is, but how it relates to your work.
Yeah.
And how you bring those two things together. Challenge yourself to really dive even deeper than you've done in the last 8 months and look for those relationships, but recognize that surface pattern is a big part. It seems to be a big interest.
Yeah.
And where are the connections there? How to mine that.
That's invaluable, Connie. Thank you.
That's a great closing comment. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Hi, everybody. For my capstone, the inspiration for my capstone started from my started from my honeymoon in Ireland, where me and my partner explored a bunch of Neolithic ruins around Newgrange. And when I was going through that, there's this very palpable sense of grandeur and intrigue that you get that makes you want to explore these objects, but you're also kind of wary of them. They've been there for such a long time, and they have a history that, like, you just kind of can't wrap your head around. It's this inexplicable ambiance that's very hard to describe, but it's very much there. When we came back to Canada, we started to hike a lot more because pandemic and all that, not as much going on. And we kept coming across these glacial erratics around cottage country and all over Canada. And I felt the exact same weird ambiance to that. So early days, I was doing some Googling. It's a very hard thing to Google, a vague feeling that you feel. You're pretty sure other people feel it, but you don't know what to call it. So in my searching, I came across the term genius loci, which in art and architecture refers to the unique aspects of a space that's experienced by people when they visit it. And like cemeteries, for example, have a very distinct ambiance to them that everyone can be like, oh, that's kind of a sad place to be, or it's like a very stoic spot. And you kind of pinpoint those kind of feelings. It's been redefined in kind of craft and art fields to not just be a space, but single objects can exude like a palpable feeling that can engulf this space, like relic objects in museums and stuff often have a very unique presence to them. So from there, I was going through some of this stuff, and I came across the German photographer Rainer, not even going to try to pronounce the other name, and he defined his photography in a genius loci sense as a characteristic part that's capable of illuminating the whole. So what he meant by that, in his photos, he would take pictures and then you could kind of get a feel for the space. He was taking a picture from the tightest zoom he had and all that kind of stuff. So my idea was to create a piece of furniture, a sculpture series. Not at the time I was not sure what I was doing, even a tiny bit, that could encapsulate the unique genius loci I felt around glacial erratics and these ruins. Mostly focusing on erratics because I see them more here, and I think it's a more interesting feeling to explore. So it started with, some basic sketches, and then in the very early days of this project, I was doing masonry tests, just actually hauling boulders out of the ground at the cottage and trying to surface them. And that died off pretty quick when I completely blew my back apart and stopped doing that. And in the early days, I was doing these like sectional table designs on how to replicate the aesthetics that I felt were in the glacial erratics through different forms of wood. I did some casting and plaster, which I'm not showing here because for a bit, the plaster is just a different way for me to replicate the same things I was doing with the boulders, and it's a little too on the nose. And it's a thing that I struggled with this to find a way to be literal enough that people get the concept, but not so literal that it's an actual rock on the center of your house. So I started with these little table forms, and then midway through last term, Kirsten really pushed me to try other furniture forms and go down other rabbit holes and broaden the scope of my ideation. So that turned into this experiment with these kind of what I called sedimentary seeding. And this is what I presented last term during the midterm critique, where I had this idea of these like this large mass that from the back would bisect a room, and you could see the kind of boulder shape of it. And then on the inside, you had this comfortable alcove. Kind of went down a rabbit hole with that, making a full-scale mock-up, skewing the slots. But as I went through it, and especially after that critique over the holidays, I became more, this became more of a self-indulgent reflection where I was delving into solving this design rather than considering my broader theming. And I felt that after looking back at it, that this was getting further away from the genius loci that was so interesting and more just becoming this couch I was trying to build. So after the holidays, I went back into my table forms a bit and really tried to make these interesting shapes that I built up at full scale, broke them apart into forms, and just tried to see like what was so interesting about the tables, because that was the other part of that midterm critique. Is the couch was there, but there were like three little models to the side that everyone was talking about more. I was like, okay, there's something to that. People are gravitating toward that. And because this is about a shared mutual feeling like this thing, I need to consider what everyone else is kind of experiencing. So I started running with these forms and just like popping openings in them, changing the shapes, hacking them up. I think Peter actually kicked that one in during the like one critique, just take it out. And then kind of going from there. So that evolved into pretty much the forms we see here. And this is a bit of a jump to the solid wood because, and I'm doing that because there were so many things with this where I was designing it in software, because I come from a SolidWorks draftsman background. So I had this all modeled in SolidWorks, and in digital SolidWorks, it all made sense. Like all the math made sense. It was all good to go. But when I was getting to the materiality, like I was originally going to do it with veneer panel, but then it was like, well, then how do I handle the edge? Like, how do I handle these funny little blends from here to here? Or how is this going to blend to this angle here, and all these like weird zones? So after talking back and forth with Peter and Kirsten, I switched over to solid wood, as it would give me some more options to do some sculpting. And then that's what most of this term has been. Like I've been focused on the genius loci, but a lot of it has been me rectifying my process of how to actually put this thing together. My other side goal, because as you guys all know, I came back to Sheridan. My other side goal here was to create a completely woodworking project to kind of revisit those skills, because it's been a very long time since I've delved into that and indulged that in my career. It's been mostly sheet stock or steel kind of design. Not that that's bad. It's just I want to kind of come back to this kind of stuff. And doing it all digital for a bit, I was kind of afraid. I was like, okay, this is just a CNC panel project. But then I got very into the sculpting of this thing when we were getting into it. I also wildly underestimated how long solid wood projects take, because it's been such a long time since I've done one. yeah, I relied on Peter a lot for his help. You can see him in the chair helping me do the assembly and all that. And so I think the project has done a good job of capturing the. Geez, this is like way too much. Yeah. Okay. I think it's done a good job of capturing that genius loci while also being a modular series that can be adaptable to a home. That's why it's got the nice like 3 heights. And one of the big aesthetic motifs that I kind of picked up from the erratics is their out of place relationship with their surroundings, where they're both a permanent fixture but also don't belong there at all. It's a very incongruous juxtaposition that's very compelling. So for me, these kind of sculptural objects work really good in like an open concept space where they're around other pieces of furniture that maybe don't blend into them, but they still are an eye-catching piece that kind of brings the space together. So it's been a lot of back and forth trial and error with cardboard forms, plywood forms, just getting these shapes to be what they are now, and then engineering them to fit together and blending them out by hand. I don't think I've ever done, even in this course when I was here before, that much hand lining. So, and then, yeah, so yeah, and then here's Peter. You can see him there helping me do the assembly. The assembly was its own like kettle of fish as well, because the way I did the assembly, all the prep I did changed right up until like probably 10 minutes before we were about to go. I had all these jigs cut on the CNC, and then when we did the dry fit, it was like, okay, we can't use these at all. We got to do new jigs. So then I made these jigs that overlaid over top and then were clamped and double-sided taped. And that's why at Peter's suggestion, I kind of forewent the small tables, because this was such an experimental assembly for me. We kind of needed to see how it went. So, and it was going to be done in epoxy from the start. Again, right up until we were like, I think we can just go with glue and kind of go for it. So then, yeah, with Peter's help, and then Christina came in halfway through as we're trying to like frantically, I'm stealing lamps from all the table saws and out of people's hands and getting it all good to go. So, but yeah, it turned out there's things I would change in the future and other ways to like expedite that production. And things that fit together dry suddenly shift funny when there's a lubricant on it. So there's future things I'd change for version 2.0 of this design. And I think the 2 small tables, when I assemble them tonight and tomorrow, I'm going to take what I learned from the big one and get them like cranked out. And then I also went into the future when I finished this and pulled some pictures back in time. So this is the finished assembly when it's all done in the next 3 days. So yeah, that was the other part of this capstone. I figured out how to do that. Yeah, so that's what the set is kind of. I find it a weird set to take pictures of and to do technical drawings of, because depending on the perspective and the orientation, it doesn't give you any real information about what you're staring at. Like, especially in the technical drawings when I was designing them, and that's why I don't have any in here, because an orthographic view of this thing is completely useless. It doesn't tell you anything at all. And then that's where I'm at, and I'm very open to people's feedback on this, because for me this is an ongoing build that I kind of want to keep refining, because I think the aesthetics are very solid. I think they're contemporary, and I think there's something that can be carried into other bits of furniture and keep kind of going from there. And I mean, I've learned a lot just from doing this, and I think as a project for me where I was revisiting woodworking, maybe I shouldn't have made every angle different, but hey, that's kind of why we're here, is to try stuff. So yeah, and I invite people to come up and kind of check out some of the what I'm calling helical blending in the bottom corners on this table and in the opening around that one, where it's shaped to match where the 2 panels came down and kind of blend things out. Yeah. Trying. Yeah.
Right, I don't
Just trying to stay on the time there.
I know I want to get up and walk around them, because
yeah,
you want to see, they're drawing my eye to move around them. I want to see what's going on all sides, which I think is actually a lovely part of the piece.
I actually didn't mention that, but like a thing I wanted to capture about like the exploring these is like when you see one of these boulders, you're like, whoa, that's kind of insane. But you also want to like climb in it and around it, or I do because I'm a man child. And I kind of wanted to make a piece that would invite people to like kind of check it out while it's also being very functional, kind of reorient these to see the way the like the negatives and the voids. Like we talked a lot about that. The first version of this was very dense. It was panels on all sides. There were no openings. And it was just going to be a massive form that just sat.
Well, I think that is one of the strengths, because I think
I agree.
a shortcoming with a lot of furniture is it is designed through orthographic views, and it has, you know, one way that it should be looked at, you know, and I remember somebody once saying to me, the best furniture looks good from all sides. And I would agree with that. And that is what is very compelling about these, is I want to move around them.
And there's still a few things here and there that need to touch. I underestimated how tough the shaping on the end grain oak was. Like I spent days going like, oh, am I going to tear that out? Oh, God damn it.
Since I am here, and then I'll pass along, I do think on some of them, your consideration for all the wood grain is really quite nice. This one in particular, just how it's moving around the piece is a nice consideration.
Thanks. I would like to take full credit for that. Part of it is as a result of how tight my nesting was on this CNC. I can only get so much space on the panels, and like I was cutting right to the edge of the stock. And I was like, I guess I'll have to rotate this panel. I hope it still looks good after it comes out.
So are they meant to be displayed together?
So that's what, so when I made the first cardboard versions, yes, it was meant to be a single coffee table that was kind of split into two parts. And it's evolved to be, so that one's at coffee table height. That one's a bit lower. That one is more sculpture, but then that one's up at like couch side table height. So my intent was that like each piece, it's acting as that singularity that can speak to the broader whole. Is like each piece, when you see it, you can see it relates to the other piece, but it can also be moved around the room, and you can see it's a set, but it's also quite flexible.
Right. So, but not in this proximity, like not this close.
No, I mean, it depends on the house, I guess, but yeah.
It's very challenging to take in.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I imagine this, like maybe there's a chair over here, and then this one's over here. You got the low table floating about.
Yeah. So the genius loci.
Yeah, that's.
I don't get it with these pieces.
Okay.
You know, I mean, I find it very jarring. You know, all these sharp angles and everything. But on their own, you know, like as an individual piece, I enjoy it more, I guess, or I can pick up on that sense of genius loci.
Yeah, I did try to.
It's very challenging whenever you've got this many facets.
It is,
right?
and
I mean, it's. I find myself wondering, is it too much? You know, I mean, it's very simple, folded planes and cut openings, right? But I find it almost too challenging. Maybe that's a good thing too, right?
I mean, for me, it started out a lot more complicated, and then I made so like I did say earlier that all the angles are different. They're not. They all follow. Yeah. These two are dry fit. That one's solid. Yeah, no, it's fine. It's not going anywhere.
One of the other things too, I wondered about, they're all sitting on this flat concrete floor. If for example, there was more of a shadow line or a base that maybe you don't see, but it's a bit off.
I do have a couple like glides that I'm putting on here that are 1/4 inch. I just didn't have them.
Right, so it gives it a shadow line around.
I could grab the carpet piece and we can put that under.
Yeah, I can appreciate the assembly.
It's a little crazy, like, and again, like it popped together under its own weight, perfectly dry, and then like I say, like.
You don't have to respond to every single comment.
No, that's.
I was going to suggest.
I liked it a lot, though.
When I saw your glue up, your clamping. I don't do miters and clamping like that.
Okay.
the way that you clamp them up, with those pieces of angled. I actually glue blocks right on.
Okay,
So
that's a good idea.
So I'll glue blocks that correspond to that angled clamp.
With hot glue or
And then I
with glue?
build them on afterwards.
Um,
Especially with
Yeah.
solid wood.
I
With
think-
veneer work, it's a little more tricky,
Yeah.
but with solid wood, it's a really easy thing to do.
Okay.
And,
No, that's good.
I just dab the glue on, let it set, and you get a nice, good clamping surface that doesn't shift, and you don't need half the clamps that you use.
That's true.
And those
Um,
wooden Jorgensen clamps are great for doing that kind of thing.
Where were you yesterday, Rob?
Yeah, well, I did something similar, but with curves,
Yeah,
not too
yeah.
long ago, and, but I can appreciate
I
what
mean,
you're going
this one was a
through here.
huge deviation for me. Like, I don't know if, I don't think a lot of people have seen my other stuff or remember it, but a lot of my other stuff was very graphic on the surface, a lot of veneer work and stuff. So
You
this
don't
one-
have to respond to
Okay,
every
sorry. Of course I
comment. I
haven't.
think Gwynne has some comments she wants to make.
Yeah, I had similar thoughts to Rob, actually, and something that strikes me as interesting in seeing your project now all together is how you've taken one natural material like rock and sediment, and which you had such a lovely explanation for that, and you translated it into another material like with wood, and it's processed through your mind as the designer and also through all this digital modeling, and that comes through a lot with the facets. And so I also feel maybe a little bit of, I guess my question is how you translate genius loci from the rocks and like the magnitude that you talked about and seeing the beautiful boulders
Yeah.
in your travels into how you've translated it through the software and your design process into these pieces.
Yeah, so for me, what the way I'm interpreting the genius look, and it's always a hard thing to try to again translate this feeling that I know I have and keep it universal. But like for me, I took an overall form and then I chopped it into broken segments and then really extended those breaks and then to add to like the mass of the object, I think the undercuts add to the kind of precariousness, and I think the genius look I will kind of really show in a home where these kind of sculptural forms don't necessarily blend themselves with every other piece of furniture, but they also suit the space. So yeah, it's hard to explain, but that's kind of how I justified and kind of what I was going for in these. Whereas like if you arrange them, you can see where this might be a broken piece off of a bigger version of that. And this is a crack off of here. So the idea was to create these pieces that can speak to the broader whole while also being their own things that can be moved around. That was like a Charlie Chaplin kind of thing.
Just wanted to say, I think school is definitely a place to not be safe and play around, try things. And it's okay if some of those things don't turn out. It seems like you kind of had a couple of ideas and at some point you had to drop them during the process. I think that's a really good skill to have of knowing when to drop something, especially if you're kind of attached to the idea. As for these, I think they do, because from I've never heard the term before. From my understanding of the genius loci was to create kind of a vibe. So when you walk into a space, like there's a certain feeling, right? Or
yeah, and that's kind of the thing I mentioned in my process doc at the end, that like the failure and success of these pieces will come with time and their exposure to more and more people. So I think this right now is a stepping stone prototype piece to a broader almost capstone down the line or something, or like just to see how they age around other people.
so I think together the three of them do have an effect. I agree with Rob that maybe you could have done a better job
because right now they work when they're kind of far apart. But if you're doing a set of tables, it'd be nice to also be able to cluster them together. So maybe thinking about those relationships a little bit more. It's an extremely challenging piece to make. You know, from like the pictures that you showed from the process. So it looked like you had to deal with a lot of challenges. Like it's impressive that you know, you've put this together. I think another important thing to think about is you mentioned when you're modeling this on the computer and everything works perfectly, and then when you're actually going to make it, it's a completely different story. So keeping that in mind. Also, I think it's something that I have to deal with on a daily basis because I'm so removed from the making part of things, and all I do is on the computer. So I think that's a really important thing to think about. But with that said, like there's something also satisfying about making something that was like really difficult.
Yeah, when we popped the dry fit in, I was like, oh man, it's just going in perfect. It's great. So that felt very good because like I was so scared that like, oh, if my table saw angle was off by a bit and the whole thing would just not go at all. So I was happy to see all that kind of turn out. But yes, the same thing is like I was a SolidWorks designer and then came into this class this year. So it's been a long time since I've done a physical build like that. So it's just it's been fun.
So I think that's an extremely valuable knowledge to take
for sure.
Of when you're designing something, if the making of it kind of justifies that form or not.
Yeah, I agree. And there's updates for 2.0 for sure.
Yeah, but again, I think this is exactly what you should be doing in school. Like it's better to kind of push things than be safe. That's a very nice point, and it would be interesting. You don't have to answer, but just if you did do a next prototype, another version, how could you simplify the number of angles, the number of panels? Because I feel like I've got the best angle of this large coffee table right now where I'm sitting. I'm not as satisfied by that weird cut panel that you're facing right now. Anyway.
Oh, that one or that one?
I think this side is really lovely. This one, that piece when I got around here is a little bit like it's a little awkward. Just this ziggy zaggy. This is fine. I think it's this. I don't know why this ziggy zaggy feels more. What's the word I'm looking for? It feels more contrived, you know?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I was looking for patterns or repeats, right? And I realized quickly that it's not there. Right? But I agree with Kirsten. There's some views that
Okay. Yeah, no, that's fair. I mean, I've been staring at it, so like it's hard for me to not think about it in angles.
I think David had some comments.
Yeah, just some comments. I was just going to say that I think like part of the fun of this whole program and like being furniture designers is that we get to make the objects that go into these larger spaces, and in a sense, we're kind of responsible for kind of framing that space in a way. So I think you've done a really nice job, you know, at the outset of, you know, even if whatever space this is in, we're looking through the object, right? We're not looking past it. We're not looking dead on, you know, it really shapes it. So kudos to that. And I think also that maybe even embrace the way that this might be made in sheet metal, you know?
Yeah.
Like it's very jagged. May as well roll with that. And like it might be way easier. Well, not easy, but you know what I mean? Like it might be way more appropriate to make it out of a folded sheet metal, and maybe in a sense create sort of a tectonic relationship where they're nesting together and able to shift around each other.
Yeah, no, I agree for sure. Yeah, I've got like a version of it that was drawn up, and anyway, that's here or there, but yeah. That's good.
Yeah, just really briefly. I was delighted to see these come together to this level, and the experience that you went through to go from the digital to the physical, but also trying to carry that sense of that glacial erratic and the genius loci, how effective it is or not is always a challenge based on the proximity of the objects and the environment itself. I think David had a really great point just in terms of the fact looking through and at the object at the same time is really interesting. So rather than having these solid forms, the solid form would probably lend a greater sense of density to the object, which might take it closer to that original intention. But I think what you've come up with is really a treat to see in certain perspectives. I actually like them when they're kind of close together and speaking to each other. And I know you had a number of thoughts of ways that they could intersect or join. And again, that's the future, consideration. I really like the little guy right in front of me. There's something very stripped back and pure about it that isn't as complicated as some of the other pieces. But I think it was a really good choice to go with solid wood because there's a sense of the quality of the object that is really palpable. And I think although someone looking at it wouldn't necessarily understand how involved it is to create all of those edges joining each other with rolling bevels to rationalize where all of the intersections fed. I think it's really great that you followed that so thoroughly. And David talked about the sheet stock, and you described your work, as a designer in industry using sheet material. So it's sort of like you went far away from that and then circled back to something that you knew, but with new information. And I think that's what growth is actually about, is, coming to something with new information, with the information you already have, and make something exciting. And so I think you really achieved quite a lot.
Happy with how it all turned out. It's been a ride, and I enjoyed the sculpting up until it was almost 2 a.m. And then I got kind of tired of doing the sculpting. But no, it was good. It's fun.
Nothing's fun.
No, especially something like this.
All right,
All
thanks.
right, thanks a lot, everybody.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for sticking it out through the morning. I know everyone's getting hungry. My name is Audrey. For Bahar, you're the only one here that doesn't know me, but everyone else, hello. Welcome back, Rob. So my capstone project is called Studio Wares. And so I started with thinking about my history as first a painter. I have a BFA in painting, and I worked after doing that to develop my practice in a shared studio space, then had various other jobs working out of a studio space as well, and then returned to school and thinking about how important this environment has been to facilitate my ideas. And so at the beginning of the year, I was interested in exploring how studio processes and the studio environment itself can be expressed through furniture and objects. So when I began my research into looking at other methodologies and other studio spaces, I looked at some of my favorite designers, artists, etc. So I'll speak briefly about a few of them. Eva Hesse, whose studio is in the top left-hand corner there. Her work, she had a very, oh, thank you, Connie. You can pull that out, just, yeah, absolutely, yeah. She had a very short life, but her artwork is often referred to as process art, and she really used the studio as a space to explore display and how she was going to arrange her objects in terms of their composition. And it was really sort of a testing site for that. And that is often how her objects were viewed in exhibition spaces. It was almost as if her studio space was spilling out into the viewable space, which is really interesting. Something that I really love about her work, and this sort of ever-evolving essence that it has in terms of the composition. There's a lot of flexibility there. And then Faye Toogood, who doesn't have a design background. She was a magazine editor before. She is now a furniture and clothing designer. She often works with making these little maquettes, these really sort of free form objects before launching into the design process, which is a very intriguing approach. And then Helle Jungeris in the top right-hand corner, that's an image of a few of her soft urns with which she, or for which she left the casting mark of creating that object. So leaving part of the process in the final iteration of an object. And then Isamu Noguchi, everybody here knows that I'm obsessed with him, but so I won't get into that. You've already sat through enough presentations about him, but so this is kind of who I was looking at and what I was looking at, the categorizing, archiving, collecting of work in these spaces, and how process was sort of kept in the final iteration of the object as I was moving forward. So after this sort of research phase, I figured out that I wanted to explore this process through the object itself. So idea generation, the early phases are the most compelling time of the design process, and I'm interested in preserving the excitement experience early on through material exploration and maquette making in the final iteration of a design object. So sort of borrowing Faye Toogood's methodology, this was the next phase that I entered into, and this is a representation of most of the maquettes and material studies that I made during this phase. So this is just an image of them here. Moving on from there. So it was really an experiment in both making fluid materials rigid and experimenting with pleating, and then also making these little maquettes without thinking about what they were going to be, without pre-assigning them with a furniture typology as I was making them, and just kind of letting myself craft these little objects and then hoping that they would then lead me to something down the line. And this led me to my statement of intent, which I'll read. Studio Wares is a grouping of designed and fabricated objects inspired by studio environments and processes. Through form, materiality, and scale, I hope to convey studio processes by creating objects that have raw qualities. In this context, I define rawness as something that communicates an idea of a process or design. Rawness represents possibility as opposed to finality. By presenting raw objects, I hope to establish an understanding of studio processes and the environment in which they are made for the viewer. So the next part of the presentation, I'm going to go through all of the objects individually, and I have a very distilled process shots and stuff because I want to spend most of the time talking about the objects and hopefully have more of a conversation about them. So the first is the pleat lamp. So here are some images of the process. So in the top left-hand corners is kind of where I started that. That was my very first material exploration that I made with pleating, and was very interested in using pleats for this object and also preserving this sort of crinkly quality that it has. So I went through a process of basically blowing up what I had been doing for my material studies. So using different glue solutions to make fluid materials, in this example, canvas, rigid. And then that eventually led me to the end of last semester where I made two mock-ups, which are in the bottom right-hand corner. One in the larger one, which is the full-scale mock-up, in resin-coated muslin. So I squeegeed resin directly onto the muslin, cut that into strips, and then sewed them together at the edges. And then this is a half-scale mock-up in felt. And what I really liked about the felt is the way that it sort of cinched in the center and has this sort of crinkly characteristic to it. And I ended up leaving the seams, it's in the final one. There's a 1/2-inch seam, extra seam on the edges. And my intention was to actually serge those edges together for this design. So that's why I left that excess there, because the serger removes some of the material as it sews those two edges together, and it's often used for materials that fray, like in clothing and that kind of thing. But I ended up really liking that detail, and that's why I kept it in the final iteration. this object, I also am trying to, with all the objects, I'll talk about a bit about this at the end, but I'm trying to balance this rawness that I've defined with control or cleanness to elevate the object. So I had a fourth year student fabricate this shade for me for the final object because I wanted it to be really well made to contrast the sort of crinkliness and the way that the form is. Oops, there we go. And then here's some technical drawings, and we'll just breeze through these. And so the next one is the rocking seat. So here's some process shots of that. People were very engaged by these maquettes that I made, which was just by taking a dowel and holding it up to the belt sander to create that impression. So that's kind of why I chose to continue developing this design, because people were so engaged by it. So this just is some of the process of making this one. Oops, I don't want to go there yet. Let's see here. So the biggest challenge with this piece was deciding what kind of upholstery I wanted to use. I wanted the viewer or the user to somewhat experience making that impression themselves. So not over accentuating the seats by having seams there, any sort of detailing, and having a material that was going to hover over the surface so that the person could experience that. And I decided on denim for now. I like its reference to workwear and that sort of connection to the studio space. And then it does have this sort of, this is 100% cotton denim. It has this sort of raw quality to it, which I really like. And the edges, I might talk about that later, they're different than here, which is, this is Gwynne testing it out. Because I finished this or got to this point with this object about a month ago or a month and a half ago, I've already had time to reflect on it and get feedback from other people. And I really wasn't satisfied with the way that the ends of the denim hung over the edges. So this is, I experimented with something else, which was to kind of cinch that material and then iron it really so that it was clung to the ends. And it might be a really polarizing detail, but that's just something that I wanted to try. And these are some more, that's what we've got going on inside that. So there's a plywood carcass that I made on the CNC. There's a cardboard sonotube shell. Sonotubes are used for concrete forming of columns. And wiggle board seats, there's some low density foam on the seats, and then the denim slipcover, and there is batting underneath as well to give it a little bit more softness, but it isn't super cushy. And that I wanted the material to be clung to this sort of hard form. Next object is the block table. This is some of the process. This was a very challenging piece. After working with textiles, I wanted to return to doing woodworking as one of my last projects, and I wouldn't have had it any other way. It was a real challenge. As Peter said, we had to push our machines to the limit to be able to make this piece due to its size and weight. And this piece originally, I was thinking about incorporating the sawhorse into one of the pieces, as it's such a ubiquitous object within the studio environment, but someone very astutely pointed out to me, Kate Jackson, when we were talking one time, it's not, for me, it's not about what, it's not about the sawhorse, it's about what's happening around it. So that kind of freed me from trying to make that idea work. And I just went with something that I thought of a lot more on spontaneously, and went with that. And I wanted a finish that was going to highlight the grain pattern of the wood. So I went with that contrasting finish, which we can talk about later, but just going to get through these. And then the soft vessel. So this was a project that I was thinking about the whole year. I wanted this object to contrast the other pieces in size and also the process in which it was made. Knitting is a hobby craft, which is achieved a lot quick, depending on what you're making, a lot quicker than all of these other processes. And I really enjoyed having that contrast between the two different sort of ends of process. So this object, as they all are, represent ideas, but this one much more so this object has, I think, potential to become something a lot more refined. But it is just an example of a quick experiment that I wanted to contrast with the other pieces. So there's it in the studio. And then I have, I'll talk about the checkerboard pattern because people might ask about that. I chose the checkerboard pattern because it shows the way in which this object is made. As the object grows and decreases in size, so do the checkers. So that sort of is an obvious representation of the process there. So that's why I chose to do that. And here are some final images of the pieces. It's my bibliography. And this is my last. So I think that this is very brief because I want to talk about the objects more, but I think the objects appropriately convey my concept and this concept of rawness. But to me, this final iteration that I'm presenting you today is a temporary phase. I'm always trying to push things further and try to achieve something at a higher level, push myself. So these are just at a very exciting point for me where I can continue to refine them or leave them aside and they'll leave me somewhere else. And that is really what this year was about for me, getting to this point with several different objects. And that is it. Oh, sure, yes. Yeah.
All right. Oh, you're going to go up and say something, George? Great.
It's more of a comment, I suppose, but I just wanted to say how amazing it is to see everything come together now and really work together. And how inspiring kind of your process of building in the physical with like your maquettes you were talking about, how that's like a project in its own, and the kind of the quantity of pieces you're able to pump out. I find that really amazing to watch it happen and how you sort of develop in the physical and even continue to iterate your final pieces. It's very inspiring.
Thanks, Jordan. I really appreciate that. I wasn't thinking about, as Kirsten is always asking me, is this a collection? And that word seems to be a trigger word for me or something, but I am thinking about, that's why I'm calling them a grouping, but it's really hard to not think about how they're going to interact with each other and what sort of relationships and balances I want to have between the objects, lightness, heaviness, the size, the materiality. So anyway.
I think with that bag, especially that everyone's playing with, it's really awesome to see you and other people in a class go home and use skills that weren't from the furniture studio. And like, I'm so impressed. And it's like, I feel like that would take me a million years to make it.
I don't think so.
One question, the other three objects besides the table are very obvious in their rawness and studio, like leftover things from the making process and whatnot. And the table is very crisp, clean, geometric shape. So I was wondering where that segment of like the philosophy came.
It's a great question. I guess in the form itself, I think typically I would spend a lot more time refining the proportions of the form, and I made a couple of models and then I just picked one and then decided to make that in full scale. So I think that sort of contributes to its rawness, but I totally get what you're saying. And then also in the form, I wanted to return this is ash. I wanted to return it almost to its natural state of being like a log, like being a tree, being something that's really heavy through the form itself. And then the finish too, this sort of, it's got, I put on a layer of this is getting boring, but I'll just tell you anyway. I put on a layer of water-based lacquer before I put on the gray finish because I wanted some of those pores to be filled up a little bit. So it has this sort of sketchy quality to it, which I think also is maybe perhaps raw, in my opinion.
I don't know if anyone else sees this, but that's a total campfire.
Totally, yeah.
Like that's the raw aspect of it, right? It's right back to the essential nature of wood for creating
Yeah,
heat.
it's really nice.
When you mentioned scale on that, like, are you happy with the scale? Do you want it bigger, smaller? What are you suggesting?
I mean, I think not, like, I don't know if this piece is worth refining in this stage. Like, I think it could maybe these techniques could be applied to another piece. I really enjoyed working with these massive laminations of wood, so that could maybe be, but I think because it's so chunky, I wouldn't make it any bigger in this sort of orientation. Like, I wouldn't make a larger size. I would then thin it out probably, and I think it would lose some of the
It's
qualities it
interesting
has.
from my angle, and I maybe to go with Connie's comment, is how it was constructed and seeing the laminated boards.
Mhm.
You know, I almost wonder if you could, with the top, I really like the control of the cylinders, but with the top, maybe it's not fleshly finished and it does
Yeah,
look
yeah.
like a stack of wood
Totally.
piled on there.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
that they're not flush or it's uneven,
Yeah.
or I could see that quality to give it that, you know, state
Yeah.
of unfinished that you're talking about.
Yeah. I did kind of want it to hang, you know, off on certain edges. I was concerned about like tripping hazards, but I think at this point, you know, it would have maybe been worth exploring something a little bit more odd, and having those overhangs there.
I like the rawness of that piece.
Thanks.
But the finishing is really finishing. It's like it's really well done.
Thanks.
It's kind of pushed it beyond the raw, in my mind. You know, and it's nice to show that porosity that ash has. There's some views of it that has just really nicely done, and yet it's so simple. But I also wondered about the scale.
Yeah.
You know, I could see it larger for
Yeah.
sure, especially if it was in the public realm. You know,
Yeah.
you know, like some kind of bench, you know, in the
Yeah.
hallway or something like that. I
Yeah,
don't
that'd
know.
be interesting.
And I really enjoy this piece.
Thanks.
You know, lighting is quite a challenging thing.
Yes.
And is that like a felt?
It's felt. Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
sorry. That was a bit of an oversight.
Yeah. and
That's
it's
100% wool felt. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a nice use of it. I
Thanks.
wouldn't have thought of you know, how it's illuminated. And you know, I always think a lot of the felts I've seen is the dark gray stuff, you know, and so to see something that's light like this and then simply worked in, you know, like, and yet it does have the rawness that you talked about, and scale wise too. I mean, it's really open to what you could do with this, right? It's got great potential. Yeah.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah. I wanted something that was oversized or large for the home. The lighting, yeah, was a big challenge. I learned a lot about connecting all those elements together with Peter the other day. My dimmer wasn't compatible. It's supposed to have a dimmer. So it is quite bright now, but I wanted to have the option of it being task or just mood lighting. So
Yeah.
that's something I can fix later.
And there's also, you know, you can play with color variations.
Yeah,
and stuff too,
totally.
right? Yeah.
Yeah,
I'll go.
sure.
That's okay. Sorry to cut other people off. I wrote it down because I could ramble for a really long time. And I think we all are in one way, just the right amount of close to all of each other's works and simultaneously too close. And I'm too close to be objective, and that might drive you a bit nuts because of how much you value critique. And I value that about you, but this to me is exceptional and visionary, and the part of being just the right amount of close means I can speak to how much you took these ideas and drove and pushed, and you have an ability to do that is exceptional.
Thanks.
And visionary and refined and reflective. in a manner that many of us could only ever hope to be. And you're so passionate about objects and seeing them through, and also so forceful in making what you want to happen. And that can sound wild, and it is wild sometimes, but also so compelling to experience up close, and now to see from a little bit further back. Yeah, point being, I find this collection very inspiring, and I have very strong feelings about this bench and the applications of it and where it could go, and how you have to negotiate, and the sensory implications for, as a neurodivergent person thinking through sensory spaces. This is like, I could ramble on forever, but these pieces are alive with your concept in a way that's also so subtle and real, and that's a really hard thing to accomplish. So
Thank you, Cait. Really appreciate
bravo,
that.
and yeah, me.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm very nervous, so I don't think I don't think my tenacity for this project has come across, but
Yeah, it's a really, really lovely collection. And I think you were talking about if it's a collection or not. I think it's totally a collection. They work really, really well together, even though they're all kind of different. I really want all of them. Really
well, I don't have any room in my apartment, so
I think what you've done really well here is it is something that is a thesis project. It's conceptual. You showed us the process, but they're all kind of actual products that you can put in your home, put in a public space. Like, they all work as real products, and they're all pretty, they all have attitude, and they're really strong, but they are still functional, and again, could work in any space. So I think that's really, really impressive and a huge accomplishment. I'm completely obsessed with that light. Like, again, I could put it in my home. I could see it in one of our projects. Like, we do a lot of like statement lights in like hotel lobbies or things like that. And I could easily see something like that. And you can do a cluster of them. You can do like a huge scale to play it up. The soft vessel, I'm also obsessed with. Like, these are all, this is like really, really strong work. So congratulations. Yeah, I love even how it was like falling off the table was it looked good. And just the interactive aspect of the bench, how simple it is, but it's still, it feels pretty new. My only comment on the bench is how you finish the ends.
Mhm.
I really liked in your drawing, it almost looked like the cap at the end was offset inside.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you can do like a flange detail at the end.
Okay.
Kind of like those flange cushions. So it's coming straight out, and it's like nicely finished. Or you could still have that kind of white showing, but it's straight out. And the inside is offset. That's my only comment on the bench, but this is like really, really beautiful work.
Thank you so much. I really
Congratulations.
appreciate that so much. Yeah.
It's interesting. I'm picking up on your comment, Bahar, and I wrote it in my notes that I feel they are a collection because you question that, and they are a collection by their boldness. Each object is really making a bold statement. It's like in its singularity. It's interesting, I struggle a little bit when I look at them, and I think that your process to get here suits your raw concept completely. But I don't see actually these objects in the end as raw, because like Rob commented on the table finish, it's really well done. The knit has the controlled checkered pattern. The wash of the sonotube, it has that dark new wash, I covet my jeans when they're all like that perfectly washed. I'd like to keep it like that forever myself. But but I don't know if that's a bad thing, because the rawness is what got you here, and it was so process driven, and it was very successful, right? But are the objects communicating rawness? I don't know. And I don't know if I care. I don't think I care. But they're very successful. So
I get that. That's an interesting point. Anyway, but I guess with the denim, I was thinking about for this object, not to respond to every single comment. I don't want to do that, but I was thinking about how that materiality for this object could become raw over time, something that ages, wears, leather, denim, something like that, or exploring this in a totally different material, like a high piled mohair or something that's a lot more luxurious, but still has a sort of animal quality. Anyway, there's a lot of ways to go, but it's an interesting point, and thank you for it.
Audrey, when in your presentation, you talked about trying to find a balance between the rawness of the material and also controlling it at the same time. And would you say that's kind of the thing that ties all of these pieces together, or does that really define the project? Is that balance between the two, or is it the rawness?
I think it defines the project and then me coming together. The project, the concept of the project being this rawness, which was sort of a new approach for me, and then me at the other end not being able to help myself in trying to elevate these objects and refine them as far as I could during this process. So maybe that results in pieces that aren't necessarily perceived as raw or understood as raw. And I don't think that's bad, but I do think that it is kind of me talking to myself, trying to, balance things out without, anyway.
Yeah, I mean, that actually really resonated with me when you said that, because I see all of that in every piece. I actually, that to me defines this collection, is that balance between rawness and the rawness of the material and the control. And I can see that tension between those two in every
That's great.
piece. The way the pleat isn't perfectly straight, and it moves the way the material moves, the way the denim is wrapped and frayed at the end and just folded under and naturally folded it the way it naturally folds, and contained it the way the control of the knitting, but then the object itself falls where it will. And then I think the references, the visual references to a fire with that table. So to me, that is actually this completely defines this, and is the strength of all these pieces, is that tension between rawness and control.
Thank you, Connie. Appreciate that comment.
Michael says that Audrey inspires me.
Who's that?
Oh, sorry, it's
Oh,
Michelle.
it's Michelle. Oh,
Excuse me.
thanks.
Sorry.
I was like, I've never heard of that person.
I have my computer so low so I don't run out of battery.
Thanks, Michelle.
Because I'm on.
That's very nice. I appreciate that.
Sorry.
Sanitize that thing.
Yeah, so how to add to anything. I think the project is so conceptually satisfying that it ties itself up very neatly, which is great. And I think the solidity of the forms is so surprisingly dramatic now, coming from the intention of rawness from the start, that it's dramatic and surprising, and the length of their gestation, and then seeing the physical objects, that's always the kind of surprise, and I think what Bahar said about them being real products, you could argue that belies their inception as raw objects, but that's the whole point. We want to actually honor the intention and yet make it with a nice finish that you can spill a glass of wine on. I mean, that's what we're supposed to do. So I think you've followed through on all the things we're supposed to do in a really significant way. There's also nothing wrong with having other people make your stuff,
Yeah.
which is basically
totally
the
agree.
hard stock and trade, right?
Yeah.
You know, it's like, how else do you do it? So I think we come from a very strong making process here, but that in itself is also shifting with many different approaches that we're taking. You know, things like working with the CNC router and so on, and that the future really is about being able to bring your conceptual strength into a broader sphere, which is really what that's about. So the studio experience is a key to your happy place, you know, and your value as a designer, and I think that's what's come out of that. I too really just love the soft vessel and the checkerboard pattern that you described. The reason why you wanted to see that was to show the nature of how that object is being formed, and it's that kind of subtle link that becomes so obvious when you look at it that is so satisfying. So yeah, it's I'll be sad to see these things go, because we've kind of lived with them in large scale for quite a while. And just to make good on something that I said I would give you at one point, and that is to honor your log. These are
Oh my God.
2 chocolate logs.
Chocolate logs.
I molded for you.
Thanks, Peter.
And lest anyone else feel left out, I made a bunch of little mini logs
Oh my
for
God.
everybody else.
Yeah, put them on the
The
table.
logs themselves are full of
They smell good.
Lagavulin and ganache, and yes, and the domes are made with a chipotle cinnamon ganache.
Yum.
So these have alcohol, these don't. So it's appropriate that she's here just right before lunchtime.
Wow.
So, well, you can save them for after pizza or whenever you want them. But thank you, Audrey, for being so inspiring to me.
Thank you very much.
Well done, everybody. Woohoo! Congratulations. What fantastic work. And I'm going to pinch a final comment from Scott Unson, who was with us at the Christmas or at the end of the first term crit. It's always really nice to see in this program that there's sort of, I think his word that he always uses, no doctrine, that every project here is unique. Like there's not a school of philosophy that's coming out of this school. It's really lovely to see that all of the projects have really reflected you each individually. You were truly on your own journeys this year, which is really fantastic, you know, and I feel privileged to have been a part of it. So well done. Fantastic.
Yeah, we call it the anti-Eindhoven.
I guess I'd also like to thank our guests very much. Bahar, thank you very, very much for coming. If you want to share anything else, you don't have to. Well, you should, just because the people who are following at home.
Thanks for having me. This was honestly like such a nice, inspiring day. It's such an amazing group. I loved seeing your work. I loved seeing kind of the bond and relationship you have with each other. And, you know, it's just like a nice throwback to school times. So thanks for giving me that opportunity.
Well, thank you so much for coming. Rob, it is so nice to have you here and hear your sage words in this critique. I think everybody benefited from your keen interest with this group. So thank you so much. And Connie, who always comes and is like so dedicated, as you guys know, to all of you. So thanks so much, Connie. And again, fantastic group. I really wish we could go out and have several drinks and really celebrate as we should, but we can't do that, unfortunately. We'll have to another time. Yeah. Anyway, final words about cleanup, anything practical like that, Peter?
no, there's nothing practical left to say, I think. Yeah, I think we've got to set a date for some kind of party. And unfortunately, it's kind of unrealistic to set a date, but let's just make sure that that happens as soon as we can. I would say as soon as the patios are open, we will make something happen. And Christina had a great idea where we could even just go to, Trinity Bellwoods Park with a few bottles of wine at some point when we can, safely do that. So I think we definitely need a celebration, and it's a celebration of this amazing achievement, not just of this year, but the 4 years. And it's so hard to look back over those 4 years with any level of understanding about where that time went. Except that I know, your calloused hands and brains probably have all of the indents to prove it. Yeah, thanks so much for these 4 years, and we look forward to seeing all the final photographs of everything when you get an opportunity to present that at the online graduate exhibition that we will be mounting. And
I believe there's a meeting for that this Saturday. Am I right? It's in the calendar. Okay.
Yeah, don't look at these guys for corroboration right now.
One last late coming in congratulations from Andrew Resor to everybody. Congratulations to all you guys. You should be very proud of what you have achieved. Exciting to watch and listen to you present today. Mel Wright also says congratulations, y'all. So much love. And Ian B, super talented and supportive group. It's been so inspiring watching all of you work and create over the last 2 years. So there we go. All right. Oh, and then process documents should be, sorry, David, process documents, they should be arriving when you guys are doing studio cleanup on Monday or Tuesday. 1 copy's for us, 1 copy's for you. I can't wait to see them like in my hands, even though I've looked at them because they are really fantastic. Well done.
Just a very brief thank you on behalf of everyone in the class to our guests and also to our instructors for an amazing year and obviously an amazing 4 years. I think in a week I'll figure out that it's all over, but right now it's just time to sleep, I guess.